There is a scene that has played at the beginning of almost every single episode of The Simpsons since the 17th of December 1989. You have seen it hundreds of times. You could hum the music right now from memory, without trying, probably on command. The clouds part. The camera drifts down through a soft, pastel-colored sky. The word Simpsons crashes into the frame in those big butter yellow letters that have become one of the most recognizable pieces of commercial typography in modern history. And then, for approximately 60 seconds, Springfield assembles itself around you the way a town assembles itself for the very first time it has ever been visited. You have watched this sequence so many times across so many years that you stopped actually seeing it at some point. You process it the way you process a familiar commute, registering only enough to confirm that everything is where it usually is, that the world is as you left it, and then directing your attention to what comes after. That is precisely what the people who made the show were counting on. Because that title sequence is not just an introduction, it is a document. A dense, layered, constantly shifting collection of jokes, signals, embedded messages, and private communications between the production staff and the fraction of the audience that might, someday, pay close enough attention to receive them. Most viewers have never noticed any of it. Most viewers were never supposed to. But the people who built the sequence put it there regardless, year after year, because putting it there was its own justification. So we begin where every episode begins, which is at the chalkboard. Every single episode of The Simpsons opens with Bart Simpson at a school blackboard, piece of chalk in hand, writing the same sentence over and over as a form of detention-style punishment. He has misbehaved, as Bart does. He is being made to write a specific line until the school bell releases him, and he can flee, which he does with the skateboard that is already waiting for him. The joke at the surface level is universal and immediately accessible. A child is being punished in the manner that children in American schools have been punished for generations. There is a specific kind of nostalgia embedded in it, even if you were never personally made to write lines on a board. But the specific line that Bart is writing changes every single episode. Not sometimes, every time. Over the course of the show's run, Bart has written more than 500 unique chalkboard sentences, 500 distinct pieces of text, each composed specifically for a specific episode, each requiring someone in the writer's room to sit down and produce something fresh. When you think about the creative infrastructure required to sustain 500 genuinely distinct short-form jokes across 36 years of production, the number becomes staggering. A book of the chalkboard lines would be a significant document in its own right. When you read through the chalkboard lines in the order they aired, something interesting becomes visible. The lines are not all doing the same thing. They are not all simple jokes. There are layers of function distributed across those 500 sentences that suggest the chalkboard was being used for multiple purposes simultaneously. Some lines are exactly what they appear to be, simple, accessible jokes built on the comedy of a child being punished for transgressions that the viewer finds funny rather than objectionable. I will not carve gods. I will not Xerox my butt. Tar is not a plaything. These work on their face, require nothing beyond the setup they provide, and deliver the laugh cleanly. But other lines operate differently. They are less jokes than communiques. They reference things happening in the production, in the network relationship, in the broader cultural environment, with a specificity that only makes sense if you understand what was happening outside the frame of the cartoon at the moment those lines were written. The chalkboard lines from periods of particular tension between the writer's room and the network have a specific character that differs from the lines produced in easier periods. They are sharper, more self-referential, more willing to say things directly that the main body of the episode can only imply. The format provides a specific kind of protection. Whatever Bart writes, he is being punished for it. The very act of writing it is a punishment. So even if the content of the line is pointed or difficult, it has been pre-absorbed into a frame of consequences. The show can say something without fully owning it, because it is attributed to a child who is already being held accountable. There is a line from a period when the show was under particular network pressure about content and creative control that reads, in its totality, as a compressed argument about artistic freedom expressed through the voice of a 10-year-old who is being punished for exactly the kind of transgression the line describes. The joke works on its surface. Below the surface, it is a public statement about a private conflict, delivered to an audience of tens of millions of people, none of whom had the context to understand that what they were reading was the writer's room telling the network exactly what it thought of a recent decision. There are chalkboard lines from the mid-1990s that, read in sequence across a single season, constitute something like an ongoing internal newsletter about the show's relationship with its commercial partners. Lines that reference the specific economics of syndication. Lines that reference the question of who benefits from success that was collectively produced. Lines that use Bart's punishment format as a vehicle for what are, in substance, labor grievances. Not written in the language of labor grievances, obviously, written as jokes as they had to be, but the content is the content. Season 8 contains a line in which Bart writes, "I will not strangle the purveyors of syndication." This aired during a period when the show's syndication arrangements were a significant source of tension between different stakeholders in the production. The people who wrote the show and the people who financially benefited from the show's syndication success were not always the same people, and the resentment that this discrepancy produced had to go somewhere. It went to the chalkboard. But the chalkboard is only the most accessible element of the 60-second document that the title sequence represents. The sequence itself is a layered visual narrative that has been doing considerable thematic and characterological work since the very first episode. The structure of the sequence, the way it moves from the establishing shot of Springfield to the individual vignettes for each family member to the couch reunion, encodes something specific about the show's relationship to its subject. Springfield does not exist until the camera descends into it. The town assembles itself in response to the act of watching. This is not incidental camera work. It is a statement about the nature of the fictional world the show is creating. Springfield is a world that performs itself for an audience and that, in some essential sense, exists only in that performance. The moment the camera stops descending, the moment the audience stops watching, Springfield is not there. This has implications that every major theory about the show's true nature reaches toward from a different direction. The coma theory says Springfield performs itself for Homer's dreaming mind. The collective denial theory says Springfield is maintained by the social performance of its residents. The radiation theory says Springfield is what it appears to be because appearance is the only tool available to a population that cannot see clearly. In every reading, the performance is the reality. And the descending camera, the Springfield that assembles itself for you, establishes this principle before the episode has technically started. Each family member's vignette in the sequence is a compressed character statement. Homer walking out of the nuclear power plant carries what appears to be a glowing green radioactive rod, tucks it into the back of his shirt when he realizes he should not have it, drives home. The rod is never seen again. It went into Homer's shirt. His family has been sharing a home with whatever was inside that rod for the entire run of the show, and nobody in Springfield, including Homer himself, has registered this as a concern worth addressing. The extraordinary has become ordinary through such prolonged repetition that it no longer registers as extraordinary at all. This is the show's central observation about how people live with chronic danger delivered in 8 seconds of animation before a single line of dialogue has been spoken. Lisa's vignette is perhaps the most precisely executed. She is in band class. She plays a piece on her saxophone that is visibly, unmistakably beyond the technical and emotional scope of what the class is designed to produce. The teacher, confronted with something his institutional framework cannot accommodate, does what institutions do when confronted with things they cannot accommodate. He points to the door. Lisa is expelled from the class for being too capable at the thing the class was designed to teach. She walks into the hallway. She keeps playing. The music is no less extraordinary for having no audience. She does not perform it differently because nobody is listening. She plays it the same way she played it in the classroom, with the same commitment to the full expression of the piece, regardless of whether the expression is received. 10 seconds. This is the complete argument of Lisa Simpson's entire arc. She exceeds the structures designed to contain her. The structures respond by removing her from them. She persists in her excellence in the spaces where the structures no longer apply, which are also the spaces where nobody is watching, and she plays anyway, for herself, because the music is the music regardless of who is hearing it. The grocery store checkout scene that Marge and Maggie appear in is one of the most quietly unsettling pieces of visual comedy in the show's history, and it goes by so quickly that most viewers have registered it only as a visual rhythm, a beat before the next beat, rather than as content with its own specific meaning. Marge is buying groceries. The cashier is scanning items. When the cashier scans Maggie, who has been placed on the conveyor with the rest of the shopping, the register assigns her a price. The specific price is $847.63, and the confirmed explanation from the production is that this represents the estimated monthly cost of raising a baby in America at the period when the sequence was produced. The joke is about the economics of parenthood. Children are expensive. Parenting is a financial transaction as well as an emotional one. But the mechanism of the joke is more specific and more disturbing than the general observation it expresses. The cashier does not distinguish between Maggie and the groceries. The same scanning mechanism that assigns a price to milk assigns a price to a human infant. The same commercial logic that values the bread values the baby. In Springfield, everything that moves through the retail system receives a quantification, and the retail system does not know how to distinguish between things that should be quantifiable and things that should not. Maggie passes through the scanner the same way the cereal does. She receives a price. The register moves to the next item. This is funny, and it is also, if you hold it for more than the 3 seconds the sequence allocates to it, an efficient and precise statement about the relationship between commercial logic and human value. The show puts it in the opening credits and moves on. 36 years, twice a week or more in syndication, millions of viewings, and the register still says $847.63, and most of the audience has never thought about what the register is doing when it says it. Now consider the couch gag, which is the element of the title sequence that has received the most public attention, and that, because of that attention, is also the element that is most frequently misunderstood. The couch gag began as exactly what it appears to be. The family runs home. They converge on the couch. Something happens that provides a comedic beat before the episode begins. The variations in what happens were initially minor and formulaic. The couch changes shape. Someone arrives first and there is no room. The perspective is reversed and they come from the other side. These early variations were jokes in the most straightforward sense. They set up a situation and delivered a quick payoff and cleared the way for the episode. But something happened to the couch gag over the years. As the show's format hardened, as the audience's expectations for the essential structure of every episode became more entrenched, as the characters and settings and relationships calcified into something that could not easily be changed without violating the deep contract the show had built with its audience, the couch gag became the one space in the entire show's architecture where nothing was fixed. The one place where anything could happen. You cannot change the characters. 3 decades of audience relationship have made the Simpson family immovable. You cannot change the setting. Springfield is Springfield. You cannot fundamentally alter the episode structure. The show has a format that has been in place for 36 years. Every structural element of The Simpsons is load-bearing. If you change any of it significantly, the whole thing shifts in unpredictable ways. The couch gag bears no load. Nothing depends on what happens at the couch. The episode will proceed regardless. The characters will be who they are regardless. Springfield will be where it is regardless. The couch gag is the only place in the architecture of this show where the production can build something completely new every week without any structural consequence. When the production understood this, the couch gag transformed from a running joke into the show's creative pressure valve. Over the following decades, it became the vehicle for every kind of experimentation that the main episode could not accommodate. Different visual styles, different animation techniques, different artists with completely different sensibilities. Content that was politically challenging, formally experimental, emotionally complex, or simply strange in ways that would have broken the tone of any episode in which they appeared, but that could be absorbed by the couch gag format without disturbing anything downstream. The Banksy couch gag from 2013, which nearly was not aired after extended network negotiation, depicted the show's own production process in the visual language of exploitation documentation. Workers in underpaid conditions completing the animation that would become the show, that would generate revenue distributed upward through a corporate structure that the workers at the bottom could not meaningfully participate in. Animals pressed into service as production tools. The sequence was an indictment of the commercial entertainment industry's relationship to global labor practices, using the opening credits of one of the most profitable shows in that industry's history as the delivery mechanism. The sequence aired once. It has not been repeated in broadcast, but it circulated online with an intensity that made it one of the most discussed 60 seconds of television from that entire year. The attempted suppression had amplified it, as attempted suppression of Simpsons content always does. Don Hertzfeldt's 2015 couch gag took a different approach to the same fundamental freedom. Hertzfeldt's previous work, produced independently with minimal budgets and maximum formal ambition, operated at the furthest edge of what animation as a medium could do with questions of consciousness, identity, and meaning. Giving him the couch gag was an experiment in what happened when a sensibility completely foreign to The Simpsons' visual language was given the show's most structurally unconstrained space to work with. What he produced was a sequence depicting a future in which the digital encoding of the Simpsons family had degraded beyond coherence. Bart's face stretched across something that no longer resembled a body, Homer losing structural integrity, the familiar yellow forms dissolving into visual noise, the characters speaking things that were not words, expressing things that were not thoughts, existing in a state that was not exactly existence. The sequence ends with a copyright notice that reads, "The Simpsons will never die." This is funny. It is also sincere. It is also, in the context of Hertzfeldt's vision of the characters as degraded digital signals persisting beyond the conditions of their coherence, genuinely unsettling. Something that will never die is not necessarily something that is fully alive. Persistence and vitality are different categories, and the couch gag was willing to explore the space between them in a way that no episode could. The couch gags collectively form an alternative visual history of the show, not the history of Springfield's characters and their situations. The history of the show's relationship to itself over time, the way it has understood its own cultural position and its own creative possibilities across 3.5 decades. The early gags reflect a young show with a formula it is still working out. The middle period gags reflect a show that has understood its own mythology well enough to begin playing with it. The later gags, particularly those produced by outside artists, reflect a show that has become confident enough in its own identity to invite complete visual strangers to inhabit and reinterpret that identity. If you watched only the couch gags in chronological order, you would have a portrait of The Simpsons as a cultural institution across 36 years. You would not know the characters deeply. You would not know the specific stories. But you would feel, in a way that is primarily visual and emotional rather than narrative, what it was like to be this show at each stage of its existence. And finally, there is the most hidden layer of the sequence, the one embedded so deeply that most viewers have passed over it thousands of times without the faintest recognition that it was there. In specific episodes, the content visible during the title sequence, in backgrounds, in specific shots, in the items that fill the frame while the viewer's attention is directed to the character action in the foreground, contains references to the episode that is about to begin, not in any systematic or universal way, but in episodes where the production team chose to add this layer. The title sequence is already delivering content from the story, folded into the visual texture of the familiar opening, waiting for the viewer who has seen this particular sequence enough times to notice that something is different today. This is the show communicating to the version of its audience that does not exist yet. The viewer who has watched a specific episode enough times to have the sequence's default state completely internalized, who can perceive a deviation from that default because they know the default so well. The show was building content for an audience that would arrive years or decades in the future with enough accumulated viewing hours to notice what was always there. This is the secret of the title sequence. It was never only for the audience that was watching in real time. It was built for the audience that would still be watching after the show had ended. The audience that would watch specific episodes dozens of times because something kept drawing them back. The audience that would eventually arrive at the frame that was waiting for them. The show put things in the sequence for those future viewers because the act of putting things there was itself worthwhile. Because craft, real craft, maintains its standards regardless of whether the standard is being observed. Because building things carefully for people who have not yet arrived is its own form of integrity. The title sequence of The Simpsons has been telling you things for 36 years. Most of what it has been telling you, you have not heard yet. You were not paying enough attention, or you did not have the context, or the viewing you needed to have done to have the reference point had not happened yet. It will wait. Springfield always does. Drop a comment with your location and the time where you are right now. I want to know where in the world this is reaching. And if you are enjoying this, subscribe now, because this is only the first section of 4 hours and we have barely scratched the surface. Section 2. The real people behind Springfield. Springfield is full of people. This sounds like a tautological observation, but the fullness of Springfield is actually one of its most remarkable achievements as a fictional setting. Not merely the Simpson family, and not merely the 30 or 40 recurring characters who appear regularly enough to have developed histories and personalities and relationships. The fullness that distinguishes Springfield from most fictional settings is the hundreds of named background characters, the specific individuals who populate the school and the bar and the plant and the church and the retirement home and the streets, each of them distinct enough to be recognizable across multiple episodes. Each of them constructed with enough behavioral specificity to feel like a person rather than a placeholder. These people did not emerge from pure imagination. The writers of The Simpsons drew their characters from the real world with a consistency and a specificity that the show has never fully publicly acknowledged in a systematic way, partly because the real people behind specific characters are not always flattered by the association, and partly because the gap between saying characters are based on observations of real people and actually identifying which character came from which person creates legal and personal complications that the production has generally preferred to avoid. But the practice itself is not a secret. It is simply unexamined in the detail it deserves. Start with the show's founding creative triangle: Matt Groening, Sam Simon, and James L. Brooks. All three of them brought observational habits and real-world source material to the early development of the show's character roster, but their specific contributions operated in different registers and produced different kinds of characters. Groening's contribution was most directly autobiographical. He has confirmed across decades of interviews that the Simpson family itself was drawn from his own family. Homer Groening was his father. Margaret Marge Groening was his mother. Lisa and Maggie were the names of his sisters. Only Bart is invented in the sense of not being a direct name lift, and even Bart's construction, an anagram of brat, reflects a specific comedic intelligence rather than pure invention. But Groening's autobiographical contribution goes beyond names. The family dynamics of The Simpsons, the specific way a father who means well consistently fails to be what his family needs him to be, the way a mother holds the family's emotional infrastructure in place through patience that is never quite rewarded in proportion to what it costs, the way the children navigate between the poles of their parents' opposite energies, these dynamics were observed before they were invented. Groening was watching a real family operate from the inside and taking notes. The notes became Springfield. Sam Simon's approach was different and arguably more systematic. Simon came from a television writing background with a strong emphasis on character observation. He had worked on shows where the joke was the character, where the comedic situation was inseparable from the specific way a specific kind of person would respond to it, and he brought this observational discipline to The Simpsons' early development. He was explicit in the writer's room about where specific character qualities came from. He named sources. He described observations. He treated the process of building characters from life as a professional practice rather than a private artistic choice. The characters that emerged from Simon's influence on the early season tend to be the ones with the most precise behavioral specificity. They do not behave according to a general type. They behave according to the particular way that a particular kind of person, observed in a particular context, actually operates. This specificity is part of what made the early seasons feel so distinctively alive. The characters seemed to have interior logic that extended beyond any specific scene because they were built from observations of people with interior logic that extended beyond any specific scene. James L. Brooks brought a different contribution. His strength was in the emotional architecture of characters, in understanding what people want and what they are afraid of, and how those two things drive behavior in directions that are funny because they are true. Brooks's influence on The Simpsons characters produced the depth of feeling that sits underneath the comedy, the quality that allows you to laugh at Homer's latest disaster while also genuinely caring whether he is okay. The documented cases of specific characters with specific real-world origins are numerous enough to build a partial map of Springfield's actual population. Chief Clancy Wiggum is one of the most thoroughly observed caricatures in the show's history. The character's specific combination of qualities, institutional authority maintained in complete independence from any competence that would justify it, sincere conviction in one's own excellent performance of a job one is objectively terrible at, the specific way confidence and cluelessness can coexist in perfect equilibrium, this required source material to get exactly right. Multiple writers from the early seasons have referenced specific law enforcement encounters in their personal histories as material for Wiggum's behavioral signature. The details vary between accounts, but the consistent thread is that Wiggum's particular brand of authoritative incompetence came from real observation of how certain people in positions of institutional authority actually carry themselves. The confidence is the key quality. The real Wiggums do not know they are Wiggums. They experience themselves as excellent officers doing excellent work. And that sincere self-belief, that complete absence of the self-doubt that would indicate awareness of the gap between performance and competence, is the thing that makes Wiggum a character rather than simply a punchline. Sideshow Bob represents a different order of real-person observation. Bob is not built from a behavioral type in the way Wiggum is. He is built from a specific kind of personality that exists in a specific kind of context, and the character is most fully understood as a portrait of what happens to a person who has trained for a level of cultural achievement that their actual circumstances do not support. The personality type that Bob embodies, someone who considers themselves to be operating at a cultural and intellectual elevation that their environment cannot recognize, who responds to any evidence of this gap with disproportionate theatrical fury, who channels their frustration with being undervalued into elaborate, literary, ultimately self-defeating schemes, is recognizable from specific social environments. Environments where people with strong, formal training in serious cultural work, classical performance, literary academia, serious music, find themselves in commercial contexts they experience as beneath them. Kelsey Grammer's voice performance brought a quality to Sideshow Bob that complicated and deepened what the writers had provided. Grammer's theatrical training, the specific way he delivers language with a weight and deliberation that suggests he has been performing Shakespeare since before he could drive, gave Bob a genuine dignity that the character's villainy would not otherwise have supported. You can respect Bob even while recognizing his awfulness because the performance suggests a real interior life, a genuine set of values being betrayed by a genuine set of failures, that the simple portrait of a criminal who wants to kill a child could not have sustained across multiple seasons and multiple Emmy nominations. The character of Ned Flanders is built from a type so precisely observed that it achieves the quality of individual portraiture despite having no single original. Groening's description of the genesis of Ned focuses on a specific phenomenon that exists in American suburban life. The neighbor who is genuinely good in a way that makes your own goodness feel insufficient. The person who does not criticize you, who would never criticize you, who is in fact relentlessly warm and welcoming and accommodating, but whose genuine virtue operates as a reproach to everyone around them regardless, simply by existing and being visible. You feel worse about yourself after talking to this person not because they have said anything to make you feel worse, but because their goodness has implicitly quantified your own. This phenomenon is observed, not invented. You have probably encountered your own version of it. The early Ned Flanders captures this type with the clarity and efficiency of good caricature, but the show added a layer to Ned that the type alone could not have generated. The revelation that Ned's niceness is not a natural character trait but a product of childhood behavioral conditioning, that it was installed through a sustained therapeutic process that replaced an original personality of barely contained aggression with the pleasant at all costs persona we have always seen, fundamentally transforms what the character is. Before this revelation, Ned is a type. After it, he is a person with a specific and tragic psychology. His patience with Homer is not saintly. It is pathological. He cannot express anger not because he has transcended anger, but because the systems that produce anger were systematically suppressed in him before he was old enough to understand what was happening. His forgiveness is real in the sense that he sincerely does not feel resentment. But his inability to feel resentment is not wisdom. It is the lasting consequence of having the capacity for resentment removed by behavioral intervention. This layer came from the writers engaging seriously with real psychological research about behavioral conditioning and its long-term consequences. The show turned a neighborhood observation into a clinical portrait and produced one of the most quietly devastating secondary character studies in the history of television comedy. The Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon case is the most publicly complex and the most consequential in terms of real-world impact, and it deserves more engagement than it typically receives in discussions of the show's character origins. Hank Azaria's vocal performance for Apu was built from multiple sources, including specific real individuals Azaria knew or had observed, and from the broader toolkit of vocal characterization he had developed across years of character work. The specific accent, the particular rhythms of speech, the combination of warmth and earnest formality that characterized Apu's on-screen persona, emerged from Azaria's creative process in the recording booth and was refined across multiple seasons as the character developed. For the majority of the show's run, Apu was treated as a genuine character with real depth and genuine complexity. The show gave him a family, an arranged marriage storyline that was handled with more emotional intelligence than most such storylines receive in mainstream American television, professional ambitions, community relationships, moments of genuine courage. There is a real Apu who is worth caring about underneath the elements that became problematic. The problem was never the character's depth. The problem was the vocal performance, specifically the exaggerated accent delivered by a non-Indian performer, and the way that performance had become, across 20-plus years of the show's cultural dominance, the primary reference point for Indian American identity in American popular culture. Children of Indian immigrants were having that accent performed at them by classmates who had learned it from the show. Apu had become the template through which millions of non-Indian Americans understood Indian American identity, and the template was built on a performance that was, whatever its intentions, a caricature. Hari Kondabolu's 2017 documentary The Problem with Apu articulated this critique with clarity and specificity. The show's response was initially deflecting and then, eventually, was the retirement of Apu from speaking roles, a decision that satisfied essentially nobody. The people who wanted accountability felt the show was avoiding direct engagement. The people who had loved the character felt a piece of Springfield had been removed in response to a critique they found exaggerated. Hank Azaria subsequently issued a public apology that was genuine in its acknowledgement of harm, even if the situation that produced it could not be unmade. He described learning, from the documentary and from subsequent conversations with Indian American community members, that something he had done without harmful intent had nonetheless caused real harm, and he took responsibility for his part in that harm. The Apu situation illuminates the central tension in the practice of building characters from real-world observation. The observation itself is honest. What is being observed exists. The people who were observed have a legitimate relationship to what was made from that observation. When the observation represents an entire community and the representation produced from it becomes the dominant cultural image of that community, the ethics of the situation are not resolved by acknowledging good intentions. The real people behind Springfield include individuals who are celebrated by the association with their fictional counterparts, individuals who have complicated feelings about it, individuals who have pursued legal remedies, individuals who have watched versions of themselves on television for 30 years without being asked how they feel about it, and at least one entire community whose experience of having their identity simplified and packaged for mainstream American consumption was real and lasting, regardless of the show's intentions. This complexity does not diminish the achievement of the characters. It is part of it. The best caricature is always the most honest, and the most honest caricature is always the most complicated in its relationship to the real thing it distorted into shape. Springfield is a fictional town built from real observation. Its population is composed of real people made fictional, real types made specific, real communities made simple. The process of that translation, from real to fictional, from observed to created, is the most interesting creative process the show has engaged in, and it is also the one with the most complicated ethical history. The characters are extraordinary. The people behind them have their own stories, and those stories are as interesting as anything that has ever aired on the screen. Section 3. The Lost Episodes and What They Would Have Changed. Every long-running creative project is also a catalog of what was almost made. The decisions that produce the final work are inseparable from the decisions that were made and then reversed, the ideas that were pursued and then abandoned, the scripts that were written and then shelved, the characters that were developed and then discarded. The show you see is the survivor of a selection process, and the things that did not survive that process tell you as much about the show as the things that did. The Simpsons, which has run for 36 seasons and produced nearly 800 episodes, has an enormous graveyard of unrealized content. This graveyard has been accumulating since the show's first season and continues to accumulate with every production cycle. Its contents range from ideas that were genuinely not good enough to survive development to ideas that were extremely good but collided with institutional constraints that prevented them from being realized, to ideas that were realized in full and then buried for reasons that are, in retrospect, more interesting than any of the content itself. The earliest documented significant case involves a fundamental choice about what kind of show The Simpsons was going to be. In the first season development process, there was a sustained and serious effort to produce an episode in which Homer Simpson, faced with genuine evidence of the nuclear plant's environmental impact, had to decide what to do with that evidence. Not the comic version of this premise that eventually became distributed across multiple episodes in the form of Homer's ongoing haplessness as safety inspector. A specific, coherent episode in which Homer was positioned as a potential whistleblower, a person who discovered something that powerful interests wanted to keep secret, who understood that what was happening at the plant was wrong, even if he lacked the vocabulary to fully articulate why, and who had to navigate between his moral clarity and his practical dependency on continued employment. This was a dramatic premise with real stakes and real emotional content. The character dynamic it required, a man of limited intellectual resources but genuine moral instinct confronting institutional power on behalf of his community, was both dramatically compelling and genuinely funny. The comedy of Homer trying to navigate systems he does not fully understand, while holding onto something he does understand, which is that what is happening is wrong, would have been a different kind of Simpsons comedy than the show eventually landed on, but it would have been comedy with a spine. The episode was not produced in anything like its original conception. The reasons given to the production at the time involved the episode's tone, which was felt to be too heavy for a show that was still establishing its comedic identity. But multiple people who were in the room during this development period have suggested that additional concerns were present. The specificity of the environmental harm being depicted. The legal exposure of dramatizing an ongoing cover-up at a nuclear facility, even a fictional one. The network's relationship to the nuclear energy industry and to the advertising categories connected to it. The concept was not abandoned entirely. It was distributed. The specific dramatic moment, Homer discovering the plant's harm and choosing whether to act on what he has discovered, was replaced by the ongoing satirical premise of Homer as the world's least effective safety inspector, a joke that can be repeated indefinitely without ever requiring Homer to actually do something about what he sees. The plot point was transformed into a character trait. The moment of potential moral agency was replaced by an ongoing condition of comedic ineffectiveness. This transformation is worth sitting with for a moment, because it describes something important about the kind of show The Simpsons became versus the kind of show it could have been. The show it became is a satire that depicts institutional failure and moral abdication with extraordinary precision and zero suggestion that things will or should change. The show it could have been would have maintained that satirical precision while allowing its central character at least occasional access to consequential moral action. The difference between these two versions of the show is not small. The second major category of lost content involves characters who reached enough development to have names, designs, voice concepts, and written scenes before being removed from the production. The most interesting case in this category involved a serious attempt, during the show's middle seasons, to introduce a character who would occupy the same economic class as Burns, while demonstrating a different relationship to that class's responsibilities. A wealthy Springfield figure who used wealth to build rather than to extract, who understood the relationship between fortune and community as one of obligation rather than opportunity, who demonstrated, within Springfield's universe, that the billionaire form of civic engagement did not have to look like what Burns did with it. The character was developed. The character had a name, had a visual design, had written relationships with existing Springfield characters that established them as a genuine presence in the town's power structure, had scenes in which the contrast between their approach and Burns's was made specific and comedic. Several writers involved in this development period have described the character as one of the most interesting in the show's history at the conception stage. The character was removed before airing. The stated reason was that the character was not funny in the way that The Simpsons needed characters to be funny. A genuinely good plutocrat who uses their wealth well keeps solving problems, and solved problems are narratively inert. Every time the ethical plutocrat intervened to address a harm that Burns had caused, the episode produced a satisfying resolution that the show was not structured to provide. The comedy in Springfield comes from the gap between how things should be and how they are. The ethical plutocrat kept closing that gap. But the deeper problem, the one that the writers have been less willing to discuss publicly, is that the ethical plutocrat would have changed what the show's premise implied about Springfield's residents. If a more ethical version of Burns's relationship to wealth and power was available within Springfield's universe, then Springfield's residents' failure to demand it was a choice rather than a circumstance. The show is most comfortable positioning its characters as victims of their environment. An ethical plutocrat would have made them something more uncomfortable, people who had been shown a better option and had not taken it. So the character was removed. Burns remained as the only model of plutocratic behavior available within the show's world. And the argument that things could be better if the people in power were better people, which would require the further argument that the people subject to that power have some agency in the choice of who holds it, remained unexamined. The mid-1990s produced a cluster of development stage stories that were abandoned for reasons connected to legal and institutional exposure rather than creative failure. There was an episode dealing with gun violence that was written, table read, and then shelved. Multiple writers who were present for the development have described the table read as being genuinely powerful, as producing something in the room that was different from the usual experience of a Simpsons table read. The episode was doing something the show did not usually attempt. It was treating a serious subject seriously while still operating within the comedic framework of the show. It was trusting the audience to hold both things simultaneously. The network review produced a decision to not move forward. The timing argument was the stated rationale. The concern that airing a substantive episode about gun violence in proximity to real events would be perceived as exploitative. Writers who were involved in the development dispute this characterization of why the episode was pulled, arguing that the timing concern was a convenient framing for a decision that was primarily driven by the advertising and commercial relationships that the subject matter implicated. This is the pattern that appears repeatedly across the show's history of shelved content. The stated reason is almost always about taste or timing or creative appropriateness. The underlying reason is almost always about the specific institutional relationships that the content would complicate. The show that spends every episode satirizing institutional corruption is itself an institution, with institutional relationships that constrain what it can actually say about the subjects it is satirizing. The writers know this. They have always known this. The knowledge is part of the show's internal culture, one of the shared understandings that shape what gets written, what gets developed, and what gets produced without anyone having to say explicitly why certain roads were not taken. The deleted scene category is perhaps the most immediately accessible form of lost content because some of it has been released publicly on DVD extras. Watching these scenes reveals something about the gap between what the show knows and what it chooses to show. The pattern that appears across multiple sets of deleted scenes is a consistent tendency for the removed material to go further in acknowledging the darker implications of the show's basic premise. A scene in which Homer understands, with unusual clarity, what his working conditions are doing to him and what he has given up by staying in them. A scene in which Marge acknowledges, in an unguarded moment with a character outside the family, the specific emotional cost of being the person who holds everything together for people who do not always acknowledge what holding things together requires. A scene in which Lisa's response to being dismissed is not just continued persistence, but a moment of genuine grief about what her intelligence costs her in this specific community. These scenes were cut. The reasons cited are almost always pacing and runtime. But watching them in the context of the episodes they were removed from reveals that their absence changes what the episode is saying in ways that are not trivial. The final episodes are consistently slightly less honest than the raw material. The editing process applies a subtle but consistent pressure toward legibility and comfort, away from ambiguity and direct acknowledgement of what the show's premise implies. The lost episodes and the deleted scenes and the abandoned characters are the show's shadow self. They are the Simpsons that the people who made it were capable of making on any given week before the institutional processes that transform raw production material into broadcast television finished with it. Some of what was lost deserved to be lost. Most creative first passes deserve to be replaced by second passes. But some of what was lost was better than what replaced it, or more honest than what replaced it, or more willing to say the thing directly that the final version chose to imply. The show that made it to air is one of the greatest sustained creative achievements in television history. But the show that almost made it to air, the show that exists in the archive of abandoned scripts and shelved episodes and deleted scenes and characters who were developed with care and then removed, that show is there too. Invisible mostly. But there. Section 4. The Voice Acting Secrets. There is a category of achievement that is difficult to discuss because its success is measured entirely by its invisibility. When a voice performance is working at the highest level, you do not experience it as a performance. You experience it as a reality. The character is there, fully present, with an interior life and a specific way of being in the world, and the human being in the recording booth whose choices are producing that presence is not visible to you at all. The craft disappears into the character, and the better the craft, the more completely it disappears. The voice cast of The Simpsons has spent 36 years disappearing into their characters with a consistency and a commitment that has no precedent in the history of commercial animation. Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer. 6 people, nearly 800 episodes, hundreds of named characters between them. Every named resident of Springfield, essentially, located in the voices of these 6 individuals. The achievement is so complete that most of the audience has never thought to ask whether the characters could have sounded different, whether the show they know might have been a fundamentally different show if any of these 6 voices had been assigned to different performers, or if the specific qualities each performer brought to their roles had been slightly different. They could have been. The voices were not inevitable. They were chosen, developed, and refined through a process that included accidents and improvisations and decisions that could have gone other ways. And at every fork in that process, there was a version of Springfield that would have sounded like something else. The single most famous accident in the show's vocal history is also the most documented: the evolution of Homer's frustrated exclamation into what closed captions have always rendered as "Dio." The textual direction for this sound in the early scripts was something in the range of annoyed grunt, or, in some versions, a specific note that drew on the vocal tradition of early film comedy, where similar sounds had been used for similar comedic purposes. What the direction called for was a general quality of frustrated response, not a specific sound. Castellaneta, in early recording sessions, was working through different approaches to this direction. He was trying different things, different qualities of sound, different durations, different articulations of the basic emotional state the direction was calling for. And in one session, working on one specific scene, he landed on something that compressed what might have been a longer, more open, more traditional grunt into something shorter and harder-edged, something with an almost percussive quality, something that felt less like sound design and more like a word that had never been a word before. The people in the room stopped. That was the moment when they knew they had heard something they had not heard before and could not unknow. The specific sound, whatever you want to call it phonetically, was immediately recognizable as right in a way that nothing preceding it had been. It went into the show. It became Homer's. And then it escaped the show entirely and became part of the English language, used by people who have never watched a single episode and who may not be entirely certain where it came from. The Oxford English Dictionary's decision to include the word as a legitimate entry in the documented lexicon of English is one of the most improbable journeys any sound has ever made. From a recording booth where an actor was trying different things to see what would work, to the dictionary where words go when enough people have used them for long enough that their reality as words is no longer in question. That journey took decades. It started with a moment of improvisation that could have gone differently, that would have gone differently if Castellaneta had found something else that also sounded right, and then the word would not exist, and the dictionary would not have it, and the millions of moments in which it has been used by people who were genuinely frustrated about something would have looked for a different vehicle. Harry Shearer is the most analytically interesting case in the main cast, for reasons that become visible only when you try to hold everything he does simultaneously in your attention. The number of distinct characters Shearer voices in the show is staggering even to list: Mr. Burns, Waylon Smithers, Principal Seymour Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Otto Mann, Rainier Wolfcastle, Dr. Julius Hibbert, Lenny Leonard, Reverend Timothy Lovejoy, and a rotating cast of one-off and episodic characters that has expanded across 3.5 decades of production into what amounts to half the population of a small town. The technical challenge of this is significant. These characters are not variations on a theme. They do not share a vocal quality that makes moving between them a matter of adjusting within a narrow range. Burns and Flanders are not related voices. Skinner and Brockman occupy completely different acoustic spaces. Otto's California stoner drawl, and Smithers' precisely modulated corporate deference have almost nothing in common sonically. Each character requires a different physical configuration, a different approach to how sound is produced and shaped and directed, and Shearer moves between them in recording sessions with what appears, from the outside, to be complete ease. What Shearer has described when he discusses this process is that each character occupies a different physical location in his body, not a different place in his vocal technique in the abstract sense, a different place in his physical body. Burns originates differently in the chest and throat than Flanders does. The physical sensation of producing Burns, the specific effort distribution that generates that particular sound, is different enough from the physical sensation of producing Flanders that the body itself maintains the distinction. The voice goes where the body takes it, and the body knows where each character lives. This is a description of a physical practice rather than a technical one. It is the language of performers who have internalized their art so completely that the art happens in the body rather than in the mind. Shearer is not selecting Burns from a mental menu of characters. He is physically becoming Burns, occupying the configuration that Burns requires, and then releasing it, and occupying the configuration that Ned requires, and then releasing that. Each character is a different physical state. The transitions between them are physical rather than conceptual. The Mr. Burns' vocal performance is the one most worth examining in detail, because Burns is the most architecturally complex character in the show, and the voice is what holds the architecture together. Burns must be simultaneously funny and genuinely threatening, simultaneously decrepit and genuinely powerful, simultaneously ridiculous in his antiquity and genuinely capable of real malice. A performance that resolves these tensions in any direction collapses the character. If Burns becomes simply ridiculous, he loses the quality of threat that makes the show's premise about institutional corruption feel genuine rather than merely comedic. If he becomes simply threatening, he loses the essential absurdity that allows the audience to stay with him across hundreds of episodes of clear villainy. The voice Shearer has built for Burns holds all of these tensions without resolving them. The aristocratic precision of the diction, derived from an American upper-class tradition of performance that is itself a kind of performance of inherited authority. The physical fragility audible in the breath, the sense of a body that is maintained rather than vital, the flickers of something almost childlike in moments when the character's absolute certainty encounters something that confounds it. All of these things are present in Burns's voice simultaneously, held in suspension by the specific physics of how Shearer produces the sound. This is why Sideshow Bob works. This is why Ned Flanders is tragic rather than simply pleasant. This is why Kent Brockman's pomposity is funny rather than simply grating. The performance in each case holds the character's contradictions alive rather than collapsing them into a single readable note. The best voice acting does not simplify a character for the audience. It maintains the character's complexity in a form that the audience can receive. The 2011 salary negotiation is the most consequential administrative event in the show's voice acting history, and it deserves more careful attention than the press coverage it generated provided. By 2011, the main cast had been working on the show for more than 20 years. The show was generating revenue that had grown significantly since the cast's compensation structure had last been substantially renegotiated. The specific mathematics of this situation, the gap between what the cast was being paid and what the show's success was generating, had become large enough that the cast's request for a significant rate increase was, by any reasonable analysis of the situation, justified. Fox responded by going public with the claim that the show might end rather than meet the cast's requested terms. This response is worth analyzing as a strategy rather than simply as a negotiating position. Going public with the possibility of ending the show was not primarily a communication to the cast. The cast was aware of Fox's position before the press was. The public statement was addressed to the press and, through the press, to the audience. The goal was to generate public pressure on the cast by framing them as the potential agents of the show's end. If The Simpsons ends, this framing suggested, it will be because the people who voice it asked for too much money. The framing was misleading as a description of the financial reality. The show was generating hundreds of millions of dollars. The requested rate increase would have added a manageable cost to a production that was generating extraordinary profit. The argument that the network could not afford to meet the cast's terms was not an accurate description of the financial situation. But the strategy worked in the sense that it was intended to work. The social cost to the cast of being perceived as the people who ended The Simpsons was real and significant enough to influence the negotiation. A deal was reached. The terms were not fully disclosed. The show continued. The residue of the negotiation, the change it produced in the professional relationships and the atmosphere within the production, is the part that has been most completely invisible to the audience and most consistently present to the people inside it. Relationships that had been collegial for 20 years were changed by the experience of being on opposite sides of a public negotiation in which one side chose to make the threat of ending a beloved institution a tactical instrument. The show continued. The characters continued. But the rooms where those characters were made were different after 2011 than they had been before it. Nancy Cartwright's work as Bart Simpson is the performance most consistently taken for granted by the audience, which is a precise measure of how good it is. The challenge is fundamental, and the success in meeting it is so complete that most viewers have never thought about what is being accomplished. A grown adult woman has produced, for 36 years, a performance that is received as a 10-year-old American boy. Not received as an impression of a 10-year-old boy, or as a technical reproduction of the sounds a 10-year-old boy makes, but received as the actual presence of an actual 10-year-old boy. The invisible component of this achievement is the emotional reality that underlies the vocal reproduction. Any competent vocal performer could learn to produce sounds in the range and register of a 10-year-old male voice. The pitch adjustments required are technically learnable. What is not technically learnable is the specific quality of consciousness that generates those sounds in an actual 10-year-old. The way a 10-year-old processes disappointment, which is different in kind from how an adult processes it. The way a 10-year-old understands their relationships to authority, which is not simply a less developed version of adult understanding, but a qualitatively different relationship entirely. The way a 10-year-old's pride collapses, the specific texture of that collapse, which is not available to an adult who is trying to remember what it felt like. Cartwright accesses these states through memory rather than through technique. She has described a practice of returning, actively and deliberately, to specific memories from her own childhood that carry the specific emotional texture that a scene requires. When Bart is afraid, Cartwright returns to a fear from her own 10-year-old experience. When Bart is ashamed, she returns to the specific quality of childhood shame, which is different from adult shame in ways that require a physical memory rather than a conceptual one. This practice keeps the performance rooted in a genuine emotional reality rather than in a technically reproduced surface. The result is a character who, across 36 years and hundreds of episodes, has remained 10, not in the obvious sense of not having aged in the narrative. In the deeper sense of still occupying a 10-year-old's specific relationship to the world, still processing experience through a 10-year-old's emotional architecture, still being present as a child in a way that requires continuous and active maintenance rather than a fixed performance choice made once and then mechanically repeated. Julie Kavner as Marge presents a different problem and a different form of achievement. Marge's voice is not Kavner's natural voice. It is higher. It requires a specific physical configuration to produce. Over 36 years of recording sessions, the sustained production of this non-natural voice has been genuinely costly to Kavner as a physical matter. She has spoken about this in interviews at various points in the show's history. The specifics vary between accounts, but the consistent message is that producing Marge is physically demanding in a way that is invisible to the audience experiencing the character's warmth and patience. What the audience receives as effortless, the quality of Marge's voice that suggests a person completely comfortable in her own skin, is the result of deliberate and sustained physical effort. The character's ease is the performer's difficulty. The warmth that the audience feels is generated by someone working hard to produce it and then working equally hard to make the work invisible. This is the most consistent formal principle of great voice acting and of great acting generally. The craft serves the character. The effort serves the ease. The audience should feel the result, not the process. Marge Simpson sounds like Marge Simpson sounds because Julie Kavner has spent 36 years making sure that nothing of Julie Kavner's effort is audible in that sound. When Phil Hartman died, the decision to retire rather than recast Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz was immediate and unanimous in a way that reflects something important about how the production understood the relationship between voice performance and character. Characters in animated shows are sometimes described as intellectual properties, as designs and concepts that can be maintained regardless of who performs them, as long as the performance meets the basic specifications of the character. This understanding of animated characters is commercially accurate and creatively false. Characters are not designs. Characters are performances. The character of Troy McClure that the audience loved was not the concept of a faded film star who introduces sponsored content. It was Hartman's specific intelligence about how a specific kind of person carries themselves, expressed through a specific vocal performance that would not have existed if Hartman had not been the person creating it. You can put another performer in the role of Troy McClure, and they can produce a character who is described as Troy McClure and who says the lines that Troy McClure says. But they will not produce Troy McClure. Troy McClure was Phil Hartman's, and when Hartman was gone, so was the character. The production knew this. They retired the characters, and in doing so, they demonstrated an understanding of their own medium that the commercial logic of intellectual property maintenance would not have required. They chose the character over the brand, the performance over the product. Springfield sounds like Springfield because of 6 specific human beings who have been showing up to record their lines for 36 years. When they are no longer showing up, Springfield will not sound like Springfield. It will sound like something else. And the something else, however competent, will not be the same place. This is the true cost of the show's longevity. Every year it continues is another year in which the people who made it what it is are not replaced but are irreplaceable. The show has been built on these 6 people in a way that precludes substitution. When they are gone, the show that exists without them will share a name and a history with the show they made. But it will be a different show. The voices are the town is the voices, and the voices are human, which means they are mortal, which means Springfield as we know it is temporary in a way that the animation and the characters and the stories are not. Section 5. The Mathematical Universe of Springfield. There is a scene in Season 10, Episode 2 of The Simpsons, that has generated more academic commentary than most doctoral dissertations. Homer Simpson, standing in the middle of a sequence that is primarily a joke about how Homer cannot keep a job, briefly gestures at a blackboard and produces what is, by the analysis of several serious mathematicians who have subsequently examined it, a functional approximation of the Higgs boson mass. Written on that blackboard, in the handwriting of an animation team that was working from the direction of writers consulting with a physicist named David X. Cohen, is a mass prediction that comes within a few percentage points of the value experimentally confirmed by CERN's Large Hadron Collider in 2012. The episode aired in 1998, 14 years before the experimental confirmation. This is usually discussed as one of the Simpsons predictions, cataloged alongside Trump and the Disney-Fox merger as evidence of some mysterious prophetic capacity. But that framing fundamentally misunderstands what the equation on that blackboard actually represents. It is not a prediction in the sense of a guess about what scientists would one day discover. It is a genuine mathematical object produced by someone who understood the physics well enough to generate it. The equation is a result of calculation, not speculation. David X. Cohen did not have a vision about the Higgs boson. He did the math. He arrived at a value. He wrote it in the show. And then the experiment confirmed the value because the math was right. And the math was right because Cohen is a MIT-educated computer scientist who also happens to hold a degree in physics and who understands particle mass calculation well enough to produce accurate approximations without access to the experimental apparatus that would later confirm them. This is the key to understanding the mathematical dimension of The Simpsons, and it is a dimension that goes considerably deeper than one equation on one blackboard. The show's writing staff, across its history, has included a concentration of people with advanced mathematics and science training that is genuinely without precedent in commercial television. The joke that Harvard sends its math PhD students to write for The Simpsons is not quite a joke. It is a slightly simplified version of something that is essentially true. Al Jean has a Harvard mathematics degree. Jeff Westbrook has a Yale computer science PhD. Cohen, as mentioned, is MIT computer science and Berkeley physics. Ken Keeler has a Harvard Applied Mathematics PhD. Several other writers have similar credentials at similar institutions. When these people put mathematical content into the show, they are not approximating mathematics for a general audience in the way that most television science approximates science. They are writing mathematics that is actually mathematics, embedding it in a comedy framework that is funny whether or not the audience understands the specific math being referenced, but that is also genuinely rigorous for the audience member who does. This creates a phenomenon in the show's relationship to mathematical content that has no real equivalent anywhere else in popular entertainment. The math in The Simpsons is a parallel track running underneath the comedy. For the audience that does not have the technical background to read it, the math is texture, part of the show's smart-seeming atmosphere, another brick in the wall of Springfield's ambient intelligence. For the audience that does have the background, the math is another joke, a joke that runs at a different frequency, a joke that is exclusively audible to people who have spent enough time with differential equations or number theory or computational complexity to recognize the specific thing being done and to understand why it is funny. The show's relationship to prime numbers is the most sustained example of this. The Simpsons is full of primes, distributed through the show's background content in a way that requires deliberate choice to produce. The numbers that appear on scoreboards, on license plates, on prices, on addresses, on phone numbers, on any surface in Springfield that carries a specific numeric value are more frequently prime than random selection would produce. This is not coincidence. It is aesthetic preference. The writers who are thinking about numbers at all are, by trained instinct, drawn to primes. They make primes appear in the world of the show because primes are, for the mathematically trained, inherently more interesting than composite numbers in the same way that unusual words are more interesting than common ones for someone with a strong literary vocabulary. The result is that Springfield is an environment where, if you analyze the numbers that appear in the show's background content, the distribution of primes is statistically anomalous. The town is mathematically strange in a way that requires deliberate human decision-making to produce. Springfield is, in its numeric texture, a mathematician's town. The most extended single piece of mathematical content in the show's history is also the most recent entry in the category of apparent prediction. Ken Keeler, who wrote the episode The Homer of Seville and is responsible for some of the show's most demanding formal content, introduced a mathematical proof within a Futurama episode that has since come to be known as the Futurama theorem. This is the right place to discuss it, even though it technically belongs to Futurama rather than The Simpsons, because Keeler moved between the two shows and because the mathematical sensibility it demonstrates is the same sensibility that has always animated The Simpsons writers' relationship to mathematical content. Keeler needed, for a plot involving a brain-switching machine, to prove that no matter how many brains had been switched using the machine, there was always a mathematical operation involving, at most, 2 additional people that could restore everyone to their original body. He proved it. He proved it before writing it into the episode. He generated a new, original mathematical theorem for the purpose of making a science fiction plot point logically consistent, got the theorem verified by other mathematically trained people on the staff, and then put it in the show. The Futurama theorem is real mathematics that was produced by a television writer for the purpose of making a cartoon about a brain-swapping machine internally consistent. This is the level of mathematical commitment that the writing staff has brought to its work. Not mathematical content as decoration, mathematical content as structural requirement. The story demands that something be true, so we prove that it is true, and then we write the story. Back on The Simpsons proper, the most geometrically interesting piece of content in the show's history is Lisa's claim, in a Season 3 episode, that the universe is shaped like a donut. This is presented as a Lisa speculation, a bit of precocious theorizing that she delivers with the confidence of a gifted child who has read more cosmology than is typical for an 8-year-old. The scene plays as a joke about Lisa's precociousness. It is funny because she says something ridiculous with complete conviction. A donut-shaped universe is an absurd image. The comedy comes from the sincerity. Except the donut-shaped universe is not an absurd image. The specific technical term for a donut shape in topology is a torus, and the toroidal universe hypothesis is a legitimate proposal in theoretical cosmology. Cosmic background radiation data has, at various points in the subsequent decades, produced interpretations that are consistent with toroidal geometry. Lisa's donut universe is not a child's fancy. It is a hypothesis that professional cosmologists take seriously enough to write papers about. The joke is that a child says something that sounds ridiculous and is actually rigorously grounded. The show allows the audience to laugh at the apparent absurdity while encoding the genuine scientific content for the audience member who has the background to recognize it. Both responses are correct. The child saying an absurd thing is funny. The child saying a scientifically serious thing dressed up as an absurd thing is a different kind of funny. The show is doing both simultaneously. The P versus NP problem is one of the Millennium Prize problems, a cluster of 7 mathematical questions, each with $1 million prize for a correct solution, and collectively representing the most significant open questions in mathematics. The most famous of them, and the one with the most direct practical implications for computing and cryptography and security, is whether the class of problems whose solutions can be quickly verified is the same as the class of problems that can be quickly solved. This is a hard problem. It has been open since 1971. The combined mathematical effort of the global research community has not resolved it. It might be unresolvable with current mathematical tools. It might be undecidable within standard mathematical systems. Nobody knows, which is part of what makes it one of the prize problems. The Simpsons has referenced P versus NP 3 times in ways that, for a viewer with sufficient mathematical training, are structured as jokes about the problem's specific character and about the professional experience of thinking about it. These references are not name drops. They are not the show grabbing a famous term and using it as a shorthand for hard math. They are jokes that require understanding what P versus NP actually means in order to receive the comedic payload. The setup depends on the context. If you do not know the context, the joke is not there. The show offers nothing to the uninformed viewer in these moments except the impression that something mathematical is happening. This is the most radical form of the show's mathematical humor. It produces content that is invisible to most of its audience and fully legible only to a subset of viewers who might number in the thousands. The mathematical jokes in the background of The Simpsons are, in some literal sense, produced for a smaller audience than almost any other content on the show. The show reaches tens of millions of people. The specific audience for the P versus NP references is tiny. And the writers put those references there anyway, because the references were right, because the opportunity was there, because the craft deserved to meet the subject at its actual level. This is The Simpsons' mathematical philosophy compressed to its essential form. You do not lower the level to reach the audience. You maintain the level and trust that the audience that can receive it will find it, and that the audience that cannot will receive something else from the same material. Most comedy television is written at a single level that is designed to be accessible to the broadest possible audience. The Simpsons' mathematical content is written at multiple levels simultaneously, each level designed for a different audience segment, and the levels do not interfere with each other. The deep math does not stop the general audience from laughing. The general comedy does not dilute the deep math. They coexist in the same scene without collision. There is a moment in a late-season episode where Homer, who has an IQ of 55 and who lodged a crayon in his brain as a child, is shown working on a mathematical proof. The proof is visible for only a few seconds. It is in the background. The camera does not linger on it. The scene is about something else. But the proof Homer is working on, if you pause the video and read it carefully, is a genuine attempt at a specific unsolved problem in number theory, not a correct attempt. Homer's math, in keeping with Homer's intellectual limitations, is wrong. But it is wrong in a specific and technically accurate way. It contains the kind of errors that a person with a partial understanding of number theory would make. It is wrong in the right way. The production team generated a piece of incorrect mathematics that is incorrect in the specific manner that a person of Homer's capacity would produce. They did not simply draw random symbols. They wrote a real proof attempt, tracked the specific error that a real mathematician with Homer's limitations would make, and depicted that error. For a viewer who can read the proof, Homer's mathematical failure is a comedy about how specific kinds of mathematical thinking go wrong. For a viewer who cannot read the proof, it is a visual that suggests Homer is attempting mathematics, which is inherently funny because Homer cannot do mathematics. Both audiences are laughing. They are laughing at different jokes. The jokes are in the same frame. The Simpsons has produced more original mathematical content than most popular science books. It has introduced more people to serious mathematical ideas than most mathematics education programs because it embeds those ideas in entertainment that millions of people choose to watch. A person who would never open a mathematics textbook has encountered, through years of watching The Simpsons, the Higgs boson mass, the P versus NP problem, the toroidal universe hypothesis, Fermat's last theorem, the twin prime conjecture, and Euler's identity, among others. They may not know they encountered these things. The information may be sitting somewhere in their awareness without a label attached to it. But the encounter happened. Simon Singh, who wrote a book about the mathematics in The Simpsons, described the show as the most mathematical television program in the history of the medium. This is probably accurate, which is extraordinary when you consider that the show is a comedy about a nuclear power plant safety inspector who sleeps at his workstation and once tried to fit a snowball into his boss's intercom. The person who does that in one scene is, in another scene, standing next to a blackboard that contains a real equation. And the equation was put there by someone with a PhD, who verified it with colleagues who also have PhDs, who then moved on to the next joke. The show does not call attention to this. It does not explain it. It simply does it, and trusts that the people who need to find it will find it, and that the people who do not need it will never know it was there. This is the deep joke of The Simpsons' mathematical universe. The comedy is so available to everyone, so accessible and warm and universal in its basic human concerns, that the technical depth in the background is invisible to most of the audience. But the depth is there. Every time you watch. Always was. Section 6. The deaths that changed the show. Not all television deaths are equal. Some deaths are events that happen within a story. Others are events that change what the story is allowed to be. The Simpsons, across 36 seasons, has experienced both kinds, and the difference between them is most clearly visible when you look at what the show was able to do before a particular death and what it was able to do after. Marcia Wallace voiced Edna Krabappel for 23 years. She was Bart's teacher. She was long-suffering and tired and sarcastic and occasionally touching in her loneliness. Edna was a character built on the specific sadness of someone who had arrived at middle age with lower expectations for what life would deliver than she had started with. Her cynicism was not natural, it was learned. You could feel, in Wallace's performance, the specific quality of disappointment that only comes from having expected something better and having been consistently shown something worse. She was funny because she was honest. And she was honest because the performance was rooted in something real. When Marcia Wallace died in October 2013, the production made the only decision that was both practically necessary and creatively right. They retired the character. They did not recast. They did not bring in another performer to approximate what Wallace had built over 2 decades. They acknowledged that the character that existed was the character that Wallace had made, and that character was not transferable. The episode that addressed Edna's death aired shortly after Wallace died and was dedicated to her memory. The show handled it in a specific way that reflected deep understanding of both what the character meant and what the audience's relationship to the character was. Ned Flanders, who had married Edna in a storyline that gave both characters unexpected depth, woke to find her side of the bed empty. No explanation. No scene of death. No dramatic conclusion. Just an absence that the narrative never filled in. Because the absence was the truth, and the truth was that she was simply gone one day in the way that people who are part of your life simply become gone. The episode let the town respond. Springfield had opinions about Edna. Not all of them generous, because Springfield is not a generous town, and because the show was not going to sentimentalize a character it had spent 23 years presenting with her full complexity. Some residents said things that were slightly wrong about her, slightly diminishing, slightly missing the point in the way that public responses to private people often do. And Ned, who knew her better than any of them, stood in the middle of it with the specific grief of someone who has lost the person they loved to a world that understood that person imperfectly. The dedication at the end of the episode read, "In loving memory of Marcia Wallace." The laugh track that had always played during Edna's classroom scenes was silent. Phil Hartman's death in May 1998 was the event that most completely changed what the show could do, and the nature of that change is worth understanding carefully. Hartman was one of those performers whose talent is so versatile and so deeply integrated into an ensemble's function that his presence shapes the ensemble in ways that are not fully visible until the presence is gone. In the 6 years he worked on The Simpsons, he voiced Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz as the most prominent regular characters, but his contributions extended far beyond any specific named character. Hartman was available. He was extraordinarily skilled at character work. He could find the comedic register of a new character immediately and execute it at a high level with minimal direction. Writers who knew he was available would write things that could be given to him, would design character concepts with his specific abilities in mind, would build narrative space for him to inhabit, because his inhabiting it reliably produced excellent results. Troy McClure was the most fully realized expression of what Hartman brought to the show. The character is a portrait of a specific and recognizable Hollywood type. The performer who exists in a permanent late career that feels, to the performer himself, like early career. The man who has not updated his understanding of his own cultural standing since a moment in the 1970s or early 1980s when it was justified, and who therefore carries himself with the confidence of a star while occupying the professional position of someone reading sponsored content for businesses that specialize in educational presentations. The comedy of Troy McClure is entirely dependent on the gap between the character's self-perception and his actual circumstances. He introduces himself with complete certainty that you know him. He lists credits that may or may not be real and that, if real, are not the credits a person who commands introductions would list. He commits completely to whatever the current project is, with the same level of professional investment he would have brought to the peak of a career that peaked considerably earlier than he is willing to acknowledge. The performance Hartman brought to this character was completely without irony. Troy McClure did not know he was funny. Troy McClure was not performing self-deprecation. Troy McClure genuinely believed he was who he thought he was, and Hartman played that belief with complete sincerity, which is the thing that makes the character so precise and so funny. A performer who let you see the joke would have collapsed the character. Hartman made the joke invisible to Troy while making it completely visible to the audience. When Hartman died, the production retired both Troy and Hutz immediately and completely. No recast attempt. No digital archive of his vocal performance used to generate new lines. No acknowledgement that either character had ever existed within the show's ongoing narrative. They retired to the same place that real people go when they die. The past, accessible in memory and recording but not in new production. The effect on the show's writing is difficult to quantify but was felt immediately and has been discussed honestly by several writers from that period. Hartman's availability had been, without anyone fully registering how much, a structural element of the show's storytelling options. When you are writing and you know that a performer of Hartman's specific quality is available for the kind of character he excelled at, you make different decisions than you make when that availability is gone. You write certain kinds of characters knowing they will be realized at a certain level. When that level of realization is no longer available, some characters do not get written, because the writing is contingent on the confidence that the performance will meet it. The writing staff's grief about Hartman's death is documented and was genuine. But the professional loss, the loss of the specific creative resource his talent represented, was also real and shaped the show's next several seasons in ways that were invisible from the outside and visible from the inside, in specific scenes that, as multiple writers have described, were written toward a space that Hartman could have occupied and that nothing in the available ensemble could fully fill. The show mourned him the only way a show can mourn someone. It kept making episodes, and in the making of those episodes, in the specific shape of the absence where his characters and his contributions had been, the mourning was real even when it was not visible. Recurring character deaths, as opposed to voice actor deaths, present a different challenge and have produced some of the show's most formally interesting decisions. The decision to kill Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, in Season 11 was driven in part by external circumstances involving the performer voicing the character, but it produced consequences that extended far beyond any administrative context. Maud's death was the event that transformed Ned Flanders from a comedic type into a genuine character study. Before Maud died, Ned was primarily a joke about cheerful Christian virtue. His goodness was the punchline. His patience with Homer was the running bit. The marriage to Maud was a piece of his character background, rather than a dramatic relationship with weight and consequence. Maud's death changed all of this. It required the show to take Ned seriously as a person who experiences loss, and the show met the requirement better than most would have expected given how long Ned had been primarily a punchline. The episode of her death is not the most interesting episode in Ned's subsequent history. The most interesting episodes are the ones that come after, the ones where the show had to figure out what grief looked like for a person with Ned's specific psychology. For a person whose ability to express anger has been conditioned away, grief is a particular problem. The emotions that grief produces, the rage, the sense of injustice, the desperate need to assign responsibility for an unbearable outcome, were all suppressed in Ned before the situation that required them arose. Grief for Ned was a catastrophic system failure. Everything the conditioning had removed was the exact thing the situation demanded. The episodes exploring this produced some of the most formally ambitious character work in the show's history. They treated Ned as a human being with a specific psychological architecture that could be mapped and explored, rather than as a type whose qualities could be adjusted to fit the needs of a given scene. He became, for a period of seasons, the show's most interesting character. Maud's death was supposed to be a background event. It became the origin point of the show's deepest character study. The production did not plan this. They made the decision that was available to them and then found, in executing it, that they had given themselves material they had not anticipated. This is one of the ways that long-running shows develop the depth that distinguishes them from shows with shorter runs. A consequence that was introduced for administrative reasons becomes a creative resource. The specificity of the consequence, the particular psychology it creates, the particular dramatic possibilities it opens, is not available until the consequence exists. Once it exists, the writers who are paying attention can follow it further than anyone planned to go. Sam Simon died in 2015 after a battle with cancer that he had navigated publicly and with unusual candor. His relationship with The Simpsons at the time of his death was complicated in ways that are documented and painful, and probably not fully resolvable from the outside. He had left the show after the third season following creative and personal conflicts with other principals of the production. His financial interest in the show continued, and his role in shaping the show's foundational character and sensibility was acknowledged by the people who remained on it. But the relationship between Simon and the show he had helped build was not straightforwardly warm in the years between his departure and his death. What Simon built in those first 3 seasons was the show's essential comedic architecture. Not the characters or the world or the premise, which were groanings, but the way the comedy was organized, the specific rhythm of Simpsons humor, the balance between the satirical observation and the human warmth, the principle that the characters could be grotesque and still be worthy of genuine care. These are not Groening's specific contributions. They are Simon's, and the show would be unrecognizable without them. The show does not exist in the form it took without Sam Simon's 3 seasons of architecture. The 33 seasons that came after were built on what Simon built, and Simon left. And the thing he left is still running. And the relationship between a person's foundational contribution to something that has outlived their direct involvement is one of the stranger experiences available to human beings, and Simon navigated it while dying in a way that was, by the accounts available, characterized by unusual clarity about what he had made and what it had cost him. The deaths that have changed. The Simpsons are not only the deaths of people directly connected to its production. The show has run long enough that the deaths of cultural figures who shaped the environment in which it was created have also shaped it. Writers who came of age watching specific films or listening to specific music, whose comedy instincts were formed in a specific cultural moment, have seen the figures from that moment pass into history in the years since the show began, and the show's relationship to its own past has shifted as those figures have receded from contemporary cultural presence into historical reference. This is the strangest dimension of the show's longevity. It has lasted long enough to outlive the cultural context that produced it. The specific America that the early Simpsons was responding to, the specific comedic tradition it was drawing from, the specific anxieties and aspirations that its early seasons encoded, these things are now historical. The show is still making episodes in 2025. The show began in 1989. The America of 1989 is gone. The comedic tradition of 1989 is history. The anxieties and aspirations of 1989 have been replaced by different anxieties and different aspirations. And the show, which has always been about its specific cultural moment, keeps making episodes in a different specific cultural moment, with the accumulated history of every previous moment in its structure. This is what the deaths have built, cumulatively. A show that is haunted by its own history, that carries every loss in its structure, that has been shaped by every absence into something that would not be what it is if the absences had not occurred. The Simpsons is a town built partially from loss, the specific losses of specific performers who cannot be replaced, the specific losses of creative relationships that ended badly, The specific losses of creative possibilities that closed when specific people left or died or made decisions that could not be unmade. The show runs forward. It has always run forward. But the thing that is running forward is shaped by everything that stopped. Section 7. The political machine behind Springfield. In November 1992, George H.W. Bush gave a speech in which he said, among other things, that America needed to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. He was making a point about family values, invoking the Waltons as a model of the kind of traditional American family that conservative political discourse in that era positioned as both normative and under threat from cultural forces, of which The Simpsons was, apparently, one. The Simpsons responded the following week with extraordinary efficiency. In a scene set in the family living room, Homer and the family watch the Bush speech on television. Homer reacts with the mixture of wounded pride and performative dignity that characterizes his relationship to most criticism. Marge points out that the family is, in fact, trying their best. The scene is 20 seconds long. It ends without a punchline in the conventional sense. The family simply sits with the experience of having been publicly criticized by the sitting president of the United States and tries to make sense of it with the emotional tools they have available. That scene is more interesting than the speech that prompted it, because the scene does what the show has always done when it encounters political challenge. It makes its characters feel things, and in making them feel things, it makes the audience feel things, and in making the audience feel things, it quietly and efficiently dismantles the premise of the challenge. You cannot dismiss a family you have just watched trying their best. Whatever their failings, whatever their dysfunctions, whatever the gap between their behavior and the Waltons' behavior, they are trying. And trying, the scene suggests without stating, is what most families actually do. The Waltons are not trying. The Waltons are an ideal. The Simpsons are trying. That is the difference. The political history of The Simpsons is not a history of explicit partisan advocacy. It is a history of sustained satirical engagement with American political life that has, over 36 years, accumulated into something considerably more complex than any single political position. The show has satirized Democratic and Republican politicians with equal enthusiasm. It has mocked liberal pieties and conservative certainties with equivalent precision. It has depicted activist causes it is sympathetic to with the same ironic distance it brings to causes it finds absurd. The political sensibility of The Simpsons is not partisan. It is something else, something harder to name, something like a specific kind of civic pessimism that finds the whole enterprise of democratic governance in America both deeply important and reliably inadequate. The key figure in understanding the show's political sensibility is not any specific writer or creator. It is C. Montgomery Burns. Burns is not a Republican or a Democrat in any specific sense. He predates those categories as a meaningful organizing principle of American life, by his own account having been politically engaged since the Gilded Age, when the distinction between parties was different and the distinction between wealth and power was less distinct than contemporary political mythology likes to suggest. Burns is what political power looks like when you remove partisan affiliation and get to the underlying structure, which is money, and its ability to translate itself into decisions that affect the lives of people who do not have money. Burns's political engagement across the show's history has included bribing officials of both parties, manipulating regulatory processes administered by appointees of administrations of opposing ideologies, and successfully defeating challenges to his power mounted by candidates running on platforms that are explicitly opposed to everything he represents. He is not ideological. He is strategic. He does not care whether the person in office agrees with his values. He cares whether the person in office will serve his interests. And he has been managing this distinction successfully for over a century. The Springfield political ecosystem that exists around Burns is the most precisely observed satirical portrait of American local politics in television history. The specific ways that institutional power degrades in small American communities, the specific relationship between local economics and local governance, the specific mechanisms by which a single large employer in a small town creates dependencies that effectively prevent any meaningful political challenge to their interests. All of this is present in Springfield in detail that rewards close attention. Mayor Quimby is an extraordinarily precise piece of satirical craft. The Kennedy family mannerisms are the surface layer, the most immediately visible and most immediately funny element of the character. But underneath the mannerisms is a portrait of a specific kind of American political figure, the local executive who has no real political values of his own, but who has very precise values about the exercise and perpetuation of his own power, and who navigates the pressures of local governance through a combination of theatrical performance and strategic capitulation that has been working long enough that he has stopped distinguishing between performing the role and occupying it. Quimby is not corrupt in the way that requires any actual corruption. He does not need to be paid to do what powerful interests want. He has simply, over a long career, developed the instinct of doing what powerful interests want because that is what has always produced the outcomes that sustained his power. The corruption is structural rather than transactional. And this is the more interesting and the more accurate portrait of how local political power operates in America, where most political officials do not take direct payments but do accommodate powerful interests, because the accommodation is what the environment they operate in rewards. The episode in which Springfield holds a mayoral election is one of the most precisely constructed pieces of political satire the show has ever produced. And its precision comes from its willingness to depict the specific mechanics by which democratic processes produce outcomes that are nominally democratic and structurally predetermined. The candidate who runs against Quimby has better policies. The candidate who runs against Quimby has broader public support at the level of individual voter preference. The candidate who runs against Quimby wins the argument in every forum in which the argument is held on its merits. And Quimby wins the election because Quimby controls the infrastructure of the election, and controlling the infrastructure of the election is more important than winning the argument. This is not a partisan observation. This is an observation about how power maintains itself in democratic systems that have been captured by incumbent interests. It applies regardless of which party the incumbent belongs to. The Simpsons understands this and depicts it without partisan framing, which is part of why the political satire has remained effective across 36 years of shifting partisan landscapes. The show is not attacking specific political positions. It is describing specific political mechanisms. Those mechanisms are durable in a way that specific positions are not. The show's relationship to the nuclear energy debate is worth examining specifically because it is the political issue most directly connected to the show's central premise and the one where the satire has the most clearly embedded advocacy position, even if that position is expressed indirectly. The Springfield nuclear power plant has 342 safety violations. It has been shown dumping radioactive waste into water sources. Its safety inspector sleeps at his workstation and uses radioactive material as a paperweight. The regulatory apparatus that is supposed to prevent these outcomes has been depicted as captured, corrupted, and fundamentally ineffective. The political officials who are supposed to serve as a check on Burns's ability to operate the plant in defiance of safety standards have been shown to be either incompetent or in Burns's pocket. This is a sustained argument about the specific failure mode of regulatory capture in the nuclear energy industry. Not in the style of an argument, which would be vulnerable to counter-argument. In the style of a narrative, which works on the audience through accumulation of evidence rather than through explicit assertion. The show has been making this argument in this style for 36 years. If you have been watching The Simpsons for 36 years, you have received, without being argued at, a sustained and detailed portrait of what happens when nuclear energy interests capture the regulatory apparatus designed to contain them. The political implications of this portrait are real and have been noted by people across the political spectrum. Environmental organizations have cited the show's depiction of Springfield's environmental conditions as a contributing factor to public awareness of nuclear energy's risks. Nuclear energy advocates have argued that the show's depiction is exaggerated and harmful to public understanding of a technology they consider important for climate reasons. Both camps are responding to something real. The show has produced a political artifact. It has shaped public understanding of a political issue. It did this without stating a political position through the accumulated weight of 3.5 decades of narrative. The show's depiction of law enforcement is one of its most consistently targeted satirical threads. Chief Wiggum is the most sustained piece of police satire in American television history, not because Wiggum is the worst fictional police officer in the history of the medium, but because Wiggum is the most precisely observed. He is not a cartoon of police brutality or systematic abuse. He is a cartoon of systematic incompetence maintained by institutional protection. The Springfield Police Department fails repeatedly, consistently, and with complete absence of accountability, not because it is evil, but because it is an institution that has been structured to protect itself rather than to serve its stated function. This is a more politically sophisticated portrait of law enforcement failure than most explicitly political shows have managed. It does not require the audience to believe that police officers are bad people. It requires only that the audience recognize the institutional dynamic in which individual competence and good intention are insufficient to overcome structural dysfunction, and in which the structures that are supposed to correct dysfunction instead protect it. This is a political observation that the show delivers through comedy, which is why it works on audiences that would reject it if it were delivered as an argument. The show's political legacy is difficult to measure, but probably significant. Tens of millions of people, across 36 years of repeated viewing in syndication, in original broadcast, in streaming platforms, have experienced a sustained comedic portrait of American institutions that assumes those institutions are systematically compromised, that the people supposed to hold them accountable have been captured by the interests they are supposed to regulate, and that the community most affected by this systematic compromise is too dependent on the infrastructure those interests provide to mount effective resistance. This is not a revolutionary political vision. It is not even a particularly optimistic one. But it is a vision that has been embedded, through comedy, in the cultural assumptions of multiple generations of American television viewers. The Simpsons has not told people what to think about their institutions. It has shaped the frame through which they look at those institutions. And the frame, after 36 years of consistent application, is pretty hard to unsee. Springfield is America, the show keeps insisting, not as a criticism, not as a compliment, but as an observation that it has been refining for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. And after 36 years of refinement, the observation has accumulated into something like a political philosophy. Not stated, not argued, but demonstrated week after week, in the specific way that the most powerful man in town maintains his power and the people subject to that power learn not to look too closely at the mechanisms that produce it. Section 8. The animation secrets hidden in plain sight. Animation is the art of making things move that cannot move. But that definition, accurate as it is, misses the more interesting technical truth. Animation is the art of making choices look inevitable. When you watch a Simpsons episode and Homer picks up a donut, you are watching a series of decisions, dozens of decisions per second, about exactly how Homer's hand moves, how his fingers close, how his weight shifts, how the donut responds to being lifted, how the light hits each element of the scene. None of these decisions are made by physics. Physics does not govern Springfield. Human beings make each choice, and the choices accumulate into what feels, when it is working, like inevitability. The Simpsons' visual language is so thoroughly internalized by anyone who has watched the show regularly that it functions as something very close to reality within its own terms. The specific yellow of the character's skin, the particular shape of the overbite that marks every Springfield native, the geometric simplicity of the backgrounds against which complicated human drama plays out, these things feel correct in a way that is not available to reason. They are correct because they are familiar. And they are familiar because the show has been consistently applying them with remarkable discipline for 36 years. The yellow skin is the most immediately visible and most frequently questioned element of the show's visual design, and it has a specific and interesting origin. Matt Groening's initial directive to Klasky Csupo, the animation company that produced the earliest Simpsons work, was that the characters should be a color that was immediately distinguishable from any other television show and that would be impossible to mistake for anything else. The specific yellow that resulted has become so thoroughly associated with the show that it functions as a brand identity, appearing on merchandise and promotional materials worldwide and being immediately recognizable as Simpsons even when no other visual element of the show is present. But the yellow also does something less obvious. It creates visual separation between the characters and their environment in a way that allows the characters to remain readable and present regardless of what is happening in the background. The backgrounds of Simpsons episodes are often quite complex, particularly in outdoor scenes where Springfield's physically impossible geography provides visual density. The yellow skin ensures that the characters never disappear into the background complexity, that they remain legible as figures against whatever ground the production places them in. This is a practical, technical decision that has had cultural consequences no one could have anticipated. The yellow skin is now one of the most reproduced and most recognized visual elements in the history of commercial art. It appears on coffee mugs and t-shirts and postage stamps and public murals around the world. It has been appropriated into contexts that have no relationship to the show. It has been parodied, homaged, and embedded in visual culture in ways that extend far beyond any specific episode or character. The decision to make the characters a specific shade of yellow to maintain background readability has become one of the most consequential visual choices in entertainment history. The show's transition from hand-drawn cell animation to digital production is the most significant technical change in its history, and the story of that transition is more complicated and more interesting than the simple narrative of technological upgrade suggests. The earliest Simpsons episodes were produced using hand-drawn animation cells, the traditional technique in which each frame is drawn individually on transparent celluloid, layers of cells stacked on top of each other to create background and character layers, photographed together to create the final image. This process is extraordinarily labor-intensive, requires significant physical infrastructure, and places hard limits on the kind of visual complexity a production can achieve at television budgets and schedules. The shift to digital production, which occurred gradually across the show's history with different elements transitioning at different times, changed all of this. Digital tools made certain things easier, faster, and cheaper. They also changed the character of the mistakes that were possible, replacing the specific errors of hand-drawn production with different specific errors, and changing the look of the show in ways that were initially imperceptible to most viewers but that have accumulated, over many seasons, into a visible difference between early season and late season episodes. Long-term fans of the show often describe the visual quality of early seasons as warmer, softer, more organic than later seasons. This is not entirely nostalgic projection, though nostalgia plays some role in it. There are measurable visual differences between hand-drawn and digital animation that are present in The Simpsons regardless of nostalgia's influence. Hand-drawn animation has a specific texture produced by the physical process of drawing. Slight variations in line weight, subtle inconsistencies in color application, the organic imprecision of human hands working at speed. These variations, which would in other contexts be called flaws, create a quality of aliveness in hand-drawn animation that has no direct equivalent in digital production. Digital animation is more precise. The lines are cleaner, more consistent, more perfectly reproduced frame to frame. The colors are exactly reproducible in a way that human mixed paint cannot be. The overall visual quality is, by many technical measures, better. And for many viewers, particularly younger viewers who encountered the show first in its digital period, the digital visual character feels right and natural. It is the show they know. But the hand-drawn period produced a visual character that was inseparable from the specific physical processes that created it, and that character is not reproducible digitally in any meaningful sense. You can produce digital animation that looks similar. You cannot produce the specific organic quality of hand-drawn work using digital tools, for the same reason that a perfectly printed facsimile of a painting is not the painting. The production team has, at various points, made deliberate decisions to introduce texture and variation into the digital work to approximate some of the organic quality of the hand-drawn period. These efforts are technically interesting and aesthetically inconclusive. They produce work that is more interesting than pure clean digital, but that is also something slightly different from what they are trying to approximate. Because the approximation is made by adding imperfection deliberately, while the original imperfection was entirely undeliberate. The couch gag has been the space where animation experimentation has been most consistently pursued, as discussed in the first section, but the main episode animation has also undergone significant evolution that is less frequently acknowledged. The show's approach to camera movement, editing rhythm, background complexity, and the relationship between character animation and environmental staging has changed considerably over 36 seasons, in ways that are visible when you watch early and late episodes consecutively. Early episodes move more slowly, not in narrative terms but in visual terms. The camera holds longer on individual setups. The backgrounds stay in frame long enough to register as specific places with specific visual qualities. Characters occupy more stable spatial relationships to their environments, and those environments have a weight and presence that later episodes have become too kinetically busy to sustain. Later episodes move faster. The editing rhythm is quicker, the camera is more active. The visual vocabulary has absorbed influences from decades of television that has accelerated since The Simpsons began, and the resulting episodes have a visual pace that is calibrated to an audience that has been watching more visual information per minute than the audience of 1990 was accustomed to. Neither approach is simply better. They are different visual philosophies applied to the same material in different eras, and the difference reflects genuine changes in both production technology and audience expectation. But watching early episodes after a period of watching late episodes produces a quality of experience that resembles what literary critics call the defamiliarization effect. You see the early episodes differently because the late episodes have reset your calibration. And in seeing them differently, you notice specific qualities that familiarity had made invisible. The early episodes breathe. They have visual pauses that the later episodes have compressed away. They allow specific visual moments to register before moving on. They treat Springfield's specific visual character as worthy of being seen, rather than as background to be passed through on the way to the next joke. This is not a criticism of the later episodes. It is an observation about the specific visual intelligence of the early production, an intelligence that the show has not lost but has reorganized around different priorities as the decades have accumulated. The background art of The Simpsons is the element of the animation that receives the least public attention, and that has, in the opinion of several people who have worked on the show's production, the most underappreciated claim to artistic seriousness. The background artists who created Springfield's specific visual world built something that functions as an architecture, not just a setting. The way light falls in the Simpson house at different times of day, the specific visual personality of the various Springfield locations, each with its own lighting logic and spatial character. The crowd scenes in which dozens of background characters have specific visual identities rather than being generic human shapes. This work was largely anonymous. Background artists do not receive the credit that character animators and writers and voice performers receive. The visual world they built is the container in which everything else happens, and the quality of that container, the specificity and consistency of Springfield's visual reality, is a direct contributor to the emotional reality of the stories told within it. You believe in the Simpson house because the background artists made the Simpson house a place with specific visual qualities that are consistent across 36 years. You believe in Springfield because the visual logic of Springfield has been applied consistently enough that it feels like a real place with a real visual character. The animation of The Simpsons has been, since its first season, the work of hundreds of artists whose specific contributions are invisible precisely because they are successful. The craft serves the story, the art serves the character, and the most complete success of any element of the animation is its complete disappearance into the world it is creating. Section 9. The merchandise empire nobody talks about. In 1990, The Simpsons generated more licensed merchandise revenue than any property in the history of the entertainment industry to that point. This is a sentence that requires a moment to absorb. Not the most merchandise revenue of any animated show. Not the most of any television show. The most of any entertainment property, period, in the history of commercial licensing. In the first full year of the show's existence, before most of the world had processed what The Simpsons was, and before the show had established any of the cultural credentials that would come in subsequent seasons, the merchandise was everywhere and everyone was buying it. The specific items that led this wave are worth cataloging because they tell you something about what the audience was responding to in 1990 and what Bart Simpson specifically had become as a cultural object. Bart merchandise sold in quantities that were, by the accounting of the people managing the licensing operation, almost beyond the capacity of conventional retail infrastructure to process. Bart t-shirts were selling in volumes that created supply chain pressures at manufacturing facilities. The specific Bart sayings that appeared on merchandise, phrases like the ones centered around Bart's resistance to authority and his cheerful indifference to the consequences of his behavior, landed in American popular culture with a force that the show's producers had not anticipated and the retail industry had not been prepared for. The schools responded. This is the part of the merchandise story that people who lived through it remember most clearly. Across the United States, school administrations began issuing bans on Bart Simpson t-shirts. The specific language of the bans varied from district to district, but the consistent thread was that Bart's attitude, his explicit resistance to authority, His apparent pride in his own academic underperformance and social transgressiveness was being modeled by children who wore his image and quoted his phrases, and the schools were not enthusiastic about this. The bands generated the exact coverage they would predictably generate, enormous publicity for the very items the bands were trying to suppress. Every news story about a school banning Bart shirts was also a news story about which specific Bart shirts existed and where you could buy them. The Streisand effect before the Streisand effect had a name. The prohibition amplified the desire, and Fox, which was not about to discourage the amplification, watched the merchandise numbers continue to rise through coverage that was ostensibly critical of the property driving the numbers. This episode in the merchandise history is interesting, beyond its commercial dimensions. The Bart merchandise controversy was, in miniature, the first instance of a debate that would extend through the entire subsequent history of the show and of animated comedy generally. The debate between the show's apparent values and the values of its audience, or more precisely, the question of whether the show was successfully communicating the complexity of its satirical intent, or whether it was being received as endorsement of the behaviors it was depicting critically. Bart in the early seasons is not written as a simple celebration of authority resistance. He is written as a complex child whose resistance to authority is simultaneously understandable, given the authority structures he navigates, and consequential, in that his resistance consistently costs him things he cares about. The show does not endorse Bart's approach to school. It understands it, presents it with empathy and specificity, and also shows what it costs. This is a sophisticated relationship to its subject that requires the audience to hold complexity. The t-shirt merchandise collapsed this complexity. A t-shirt cannot hold nuance. A t-shirt can hold a phrase. And the phrases selected for merchandise were the most quotable expressions of Bart's resistance without the context that complicated it in the episodes. So the merchandise Bart was a different Bart than the show Bart. The merchandise Bart was the thing the schools banned. The show Bart was too complicated for banning, which is probably why the banning mostly focused on the merchandise rather than the show itself. The commercial licensing operation has continued, with varying intensity and varying degrees of cultural saturation, for the entire 36-year run of the show. The operation has grown into something of extraordinary scale and complexity. Licensed products exist in virtually every consumer category. They range from the expected apparel, toys, games, home goods, to the genuinely unexpected architecture, where Simpson-inspired design elements have appeared in multiple contexts, and food products in multiple countries that use Simpsons branding in ways that navigate the specific regulatory requirements of each market differently. The international dimensions of the merchandise operation reflect the show's global reach in ways that are worth examining. The Simpsons has been translated and dubbed into dozens of languages, and in many of those linguistic markets, it has achieved cultural saturation comparable to its American penetration. The merchandise in these markets reflects local conditions in ways that the American operation does not need to consider. In several European markets, The Simpsons merchandise licensing has had to navigate cultural differences in what is considered appropriate product association that has produced genuinely interesting edge cases. Products that are straightforwardly approvable under American commercial standards require additional consideration in markets where the show's satirical content is received through a different cultural lens, where the specific elements being satirized do not have the same cultural resonance, or where the character associations that seem obvious in the American context translate differently. The most commercially successful element of the merchandise empire in recent decades is the Springfield experience in theme parks, specifically the Simpsons-themed area at Universal Studios, that has been operating in various forms and locations since 2008. The development of the Springfield theme park area was a collaboration between the show's production and Universal that involved a level of creative investment unusual for theme park development. Theme park environments are typically designed around a small number of iconic visual elements from a property, selected for their immediate recognizability and their amenability to three-dimensional physical construction. The Matterhorn is the Matterhorn. The Hogwarts Castle is the Hogwarts Castle. You design around the iconic element and build a coherent environment around it. The Springfield area presented a different challenge because Springfield's visual identity is distributed across hundreds of specific locations, none of which is iconic in the way that a single central structure is iconic, and all of which derive their meaning from their relationship to the characters and stories, rather than from their visual quality in isolation. Moe's Tavern means something because you know what happens in Moe's Tavern, who sits at the bar, what they order, how the bar smells according to characters who have referenced the smell in specific ways across specific episodes. Without that accumulated narrative weight, Moe's Tavern is just a bar, a somewhat run-down-looking bar with a specific color scheme. The design team worked with the show's production to build enough specific visual detail into the Springfield area that visitors with the relevant background knowledge would find it recognizable and resonant, while maintaining enough basic visual appeal that visitors without that background could enjoy the space on its own visual terms. This is a genuinely difficult design problem, and the solutions are imperfect but more interesting than most theme park environments, because the problem forced the design team to think carefully about what Springfield actually is as a visual experience, rather than simply replicating its most famous elements at human scale. The food offerings at the Springfield area are perhaps the most culturally interesting element of the theme park environment. The Lard Lad donuts, the Duff beer, the Krusty burgers, these are items that exist in the show as satirical objects. Lard Lad donuts are enormous to the point of absurdity, representing the show's consistent satirical engagement with American overconsumption. Duff Beer is a fictional beer brand whose marketing satire has been one of the show's recurring threads for 3 decades. Krusty Burgers are produced by a clown who the show has established cares about profit to the complete exclusion of food quality or safety. When these items became available for purchase in an actual theme park, they crossed from satire to commodity in a way that raises the question the show has always been aware of, but has handled with varying degrees of grace. What happens to satire when it becomes the thing being satirized? The Lard Lad donut at Universal is, by most accounts, a good donut. It is large, it is sweet, it is purchased and consumed by visitors who enjoy it. The satirical content of the donut as a narrative object in the show has not transformed into satirical content in the theme park environment. It has transformed into a donut. The donut is good, the satire is absent. This is the fundamental tension in the merchandise empire's relationship to the show it is built around. The show is, among other things, a satire of American consumer culture. The merchandise is American consumer culture, in exactly the forms the show satirizes. The people who buy Simpsons products are, in many cases, buying objects produced by the commercial entertainment industry to be consumed by the audience whose consumption patterns the show is commenting on. The satirist and the satirized have become indistinguishable. This is not a failure of the show. It is a consequence of the show's success that the show itself, being the show it is, would find darkly funny. The show knows this. There have been episodes that address the commercialization of The Simpsons directly, that treat the merchandising of the family's image as a story point, that follow the comic and tragic consequences of having your identity become a product. These episodes are some of the most self-aware in the show's history. They demonstrate a level of comfort with examining their own cultural position that most shows never develop, because most shows do not have the longevity required to develop it. The merchandise empire is, finally, inseparable from the show's cultural legacy. In the same way that the show's cultural legacy is inseparable from the 36 years of production that preceded and accompanied the merchandise. You cannot separate the cultural object from the commercial operation that has sustained it. The show exists because it generates revenue. The merchandise is a major component of the revenue. The revenue enables the show. The show enables the merchandise. The loop is closed, and the analysis that insists on separating the artistic achievement from the commercial operation that makes it possible has always been naive. The art is there, the commerce is there. They have been producing each other for 36 years, and the result is both. Section 10. The architecture of Springfield's impossible geography. There is a specific kind of map that appears in the show's merchandise, a detailed, formally designed document purporting to show the layout of Springfield. It has streets with names. It has landmarks in specific locations relative to each other. It has the power plant positioned in a particular relationship to the river. It has the school at a particular remove from the residential areas. It is a coherent, navigable map of a specific place. It is also wrong. Not wrong in the way that any map is wrong, which is to say necessarily simplified and therefore necessarily distorted. Wrong in the sense that it contradicts the spatial relationships depicted in the show itself. The nuclear plant is not where the map says it is, if you trace the routes characters take in specific episodes. The school is not at the distance from the neighborhood that the map indicates if you measure against the travel times established in specific scenes. Moe's Tavern is not in the spatial relationship to the Simpsons house that the map shows if you track the geography of specific sequences. The map of Springfield is, in other words, a fiction of a fiction. It depicts a version of Springfield that is more coherent than the actual fictional Springfield, while being less accurate to the available evidence than the careful viewer who has tracked the geography across hundreds of episodes. This is a strange situation. The official documentation of the fictional place is less internally consistent than the unofficial reconstruction available to the dedicated fan. But this is also, when you understand the specific nature of Springfield's spatial logic, perfectly appropriate, because Springfield does not have a coherent geography in the sense that the map attempts to impose. Springfield has a narrative geography, which is a completely different thing. A narrative geography is organized around the needs of the story rather than around the spatial logic of a real location. Distances in Springfield are whatever distance serves the current episode. The power plant is near enough for Homer to ride his bicycle to work in some episodes and far enough to require an extended commute in others, because near and far are determined by what the story needs rather than by any consistent spatial relationship between Homer's house and the plant. This is how fiction has always worked in certain registers. Stage plays have notorious geography, where characters who are supposed to be on opposite sides of a city appear in the same scene after intervals too short to allow real travel. Novels move characters through space according to narrative necessity without consistent attention to spatial logic. These are not failures of craft. They are choices that prioritize story over geography, that treat space as a tool of narrative rather than a constraint upon it. What makes Springfield interesting is that it is the most extended and most detailed application of narrative geography in the history of the visual medium. Because the show has been depicting Springfield as a specific place for 36 years, across hundreds of episodes in which specific locations appear and reappear in both consistent and inconsistent spatial relationships, the accumulated geography of Springfield is a palimpsest of hundreds of individual narrative decisions rather than a coherent spatial plan. You can map Springfield. People have tried. The attempts produce documents of extreme ambition and limited consistency because the material being mapped is itself internally inconsistent. Every episode adds new information, and new information sometimes confirms existing relationships and sometimes contradicts them. The map is a living document in a field that keeps updating. Every new episode is potential new evidence, and the evidence does not always point in the same direction. The state problem, which is the most publicly discussed element of Springfield's geographic mystery, is interesting primarily because the show has been so explicit and so sustained in its refusal to resolve it. The specific geography of states in the United States is publicly documented. Every viewer of The Simpsons who has basic geographic literacy could, in principle, rule out the majority of states as possibilities for Springfield based on geographic clues provided in the show. The show has provided climate information. It has provided geological information. It has shown geographic relationships to other states. It has even, on occasion, shown characters travel by car to adjacent states, establishing that specific places are within driving distance. The process of elimination, pursued systematically, should narrow the field to a manageable number of candidates. And indeed, dedicated geography-oriented fans have done exactly this, producing analysis that narrows Springfield to a small number of plausible states. But the show keeps providing new information that contradicts the existing analysis, reopening possibilities that had been ruled out, creating new inconsistencies that require the reconstruction to be revised. This is not accidental. The writers are aware of the fan analysis. They are aware of which clues have been accepted and which have been ruled out. And they continue to produce clues that keep the question open because the question being open is part of the show's identity. Matt Groening's 2012 confession that Springfield was named for Springfield, Oregon, is the most direct. The show's creator has been about the geographic question, and its aftermath is instructive. The confession was real. It reflected a real decision made for real reasons in the show's early development. Springfield, Oregon was a place Groening knew. He chose the most common city name in America to give the show a universal quality. He named it after a specific instance of that universal name. But the confession did not close the question, because closing the question would require acknowledging that all the episodes set in specific geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon were simply wrong, and the show is not willing to say that its own episodes are wrong. So the confession was true and inadequate simultaneously. Groening said where the name came from. The name's origin does not determine the location of the thing named. Springfield is named for Springfield, Oregon, and exists in a location that cannot be fully reconciled with Oregon. Both of these things are true at once. The show has been in this situation since its first season. Every geographic choice it makes either adds to the already unresolvable accumulation of evidence or, occasionally, adds a new piece that temporarily makes some candidates more plausible, before the next episode adds something that complicates the picture again. The geography of Springfield is a conversation the show is having with its most geographically obsessed viewers, a conversation that will never reach a conclusion because the show benefits from the conversation continuing more than from its resolution. There is a more interesting interpretation of Springfield's geographic impossibility that goes beyond the production rationale for maintaining audience engagement and the legal rationale for avoiding libel exposure in any specific real Springfield. Springfield's geographic impossibility is the visual correlate of the town's psychological impossibility. The town is not situated in normal geographic space because it is not situated in normal psychological space. A town that cannot age, cannot remember, cannot process consequences, cannot maintain consistent spatial relationships between its own locations, is a town that operates by a different logic than the logic of the real world. Its geography is as unstable as its residents' memories. Its spatial relationships are as contingent as its continuity. Everything in Springfield is where it needs to be right now, and what it needs to be tomorrow will be determined by tomorrow's needs. This is, if you accept the more speculative interpretations of the show's nature, precisely what you would expect. Homer's dreaming mind does not have a map of Springfield. It has impressions and needs and narrative requirements. The Springfield of the coma theory is assembled on demand from whatever is required by the current sequence, which is why it cannot be mapped. It does not have a stable underlying geography to map from. The radiation theory offers a different reading. If the contamination from the nuclear plant has warped biological processes, why should spatial processes be exempt? A zone of chronic nuclear contamination severe enough to prevent aging and to compromise the cognitive capacity of an entire population might also be doing things to the space around it that are not consistent with normal spatial physics. The three-eyed fish is the biological evidence of the contamination. Springfield's impossible geography is the spatial evidence. And the collective denial theory, a town that has agreed to forget inconvenient truths about its present, has also agreed to maintain convenient fictions about its own geography. It is very convenient for certain institutional interests in Springfield that the town's regulatory jurisdiction is ambiguous. You cannot bring consistent regulatory oversight to a town whose location is inconsistent. You cannot enforce consistent federal environmental standards on a facility that might be in any of several dozen states depending on which episode you reference. Springfield's geographic ambiguity is not just a creative choice. It is a structural feature of a town that has been organized to resist accountability. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The most complete reading of Springfield's geographic impossibility is probably the one that holds all of them simultaneously. The town cannot be mapped because it was not designed to be mappable. It is useful to the production, useful to certain interests within the narrative, and useful to the show's relationship with its own nature that Springfield remain unlocked. A town without coordinates cannot be brought to account. A dreaming mind does not need a map. A contamination zone that warps space cannot produce consistent spatial information. And so Springfield continues to be everywhere and nowhere. Its nuclear plant is near the river and also far from the river. Its school is close to the neighborhood and also requires a substantial drive. Its coastline appears in some episodes, and its landlocked interior appears in others. It has mountains when the story needs mountains, and flat plains when the story needs plains. It is, in this sense, the most American of American towns. Because America itself is too large and too various to be coherently described from any single position. America contains mountains and coasts and plains and deserts and every kind of human geography in a space that no single person can encompass. Springfield, which is everywhere and therefore America, contains all of this simultaneously, which is impossible, which is the point, which is exactly right. Final section. Everything the show was always trying to tell you. We have spent a long time in Springfield. We have looked at the title sequence that has been running for 36 years and found, in its 60 seconds, a compressed document about art and commerce and the specific experience of watching something so familiar that you have stopped registering it. We have traced the real people behind the fictional population of a fictional town and found that the translation from observation to character is never clean and never consequence-free, and that the show's greatest characters are the ones where the observation was most honest and the translation most precise. We have opened the filing cabinet of unrealized content and found, in what was not made, evidence of what the institutional pressures on a major commercial entertainment property actually prevent. We have listened to the voices, the 6 specific human beings who have been producing Springfield's acoustic reality for 36 years, and found in their work a form of craft that is most visible in its own invisibility. We have examined the mathematics embedded in the comedy and found a parallel track running at a different frequency underneath the humor, audible only to people with the specific training to receive it. We have traced the deaths that have changed the show and found that what the show became was shaped as much by what it lost as by what it built. We have looked at the political content of a show that insists it has no political agenda and found a sustained, sophisticated argument about the specific failure modes of American democratic institutions, delivered not as argument but as narrative, and therefore more durable than argument, because it bypasses the audience's resistance to being argued at. We have examined the visual language of the animation and found, in the specific choices about line and color and movement, a form of visual intelligence that works on the audience constantly, without the audience being aware it is being worked on. We have spent time with the merchandise empire and found, in the relationship between the satirist and the commodity it has become, a perfect illustration of the specific contradiction the show has inhabited for its entire existence. And we have tried to map Springfield and found a town that cannot be mapped, because its geography is organized by narrative rather than by physics, and a geography organized by narrative is a geography that serves the story rather than constraining it. And now we arrive at the place all of these threads are pointing, the place that you can only reach by following all of them simultaneously and letting them converge. The Simpsons is a show about a specific thing, not about a nuclear plant, or a dysfunctional family or American institutional failure, or the specific experiences of the American working class, or the nature of time in long-running narrative fiction. It is a show about all of those things, and the thing it is actually about is the relationship between all of them. The relationship between Homer's stupidity and the nuclear plant. The relationship between the nuclear plant and Burns. The relationship between Burns and the political system. The relationship between the political system and the community that the political system is supposed to serve, but that is actually serving the political system. And the relationship between all of this and the family at the center of it, trying every episode to be okay in a context that was designed to make them not quite okay. The show is a portrait of an environment and of a family inside that environment, but it is not a portrait of a specific American environment. It is a portrait of the structural principle that produces every American environment that resembles Springfield, which is the structural principle by which concentrated power maintains itself through the specific kinds of damage it does to the people subject to it. Homer is not Homer because he is unlucky. He is Homer because the environment in which he was raised, the environment that Burns deliberately shaped to produce the kind of worker Burns needed, produced him. His stupidity is not a natural characteristic. It is an outcome. The crayon in his brain is a metaphor for everything that was done to him, beginning with Mona's exile and the maternal loss that followed from it, continuing through the specific working conditions of the nuclear plant and the specific neurological damage they produce, and maintained by an institutional and medical apparatus that serves Burns's interest in a workforce that cannot effectively resist what is happening to it. This is not a metaphor for capitalism in the abstract. It is a very specific portrait of a specific mechanism by which concentrated economic power translates itself into concentrated social power, translates itself into cognitive and emotional outcomes for the people at the bottom of the structure. The show has been depicting this mechanism in detail, consistently, for 36 years. And it depicts it through a comedy, which is why it works. The comedy does not dilute the content. It protects it. A direct depiction of the same material in the register of drama would be resistible. The audience would feel argued at. They would respond with their political defenses. They would engage with the content as content, which means engaging with it as something that can be agreed with or disagreed with, something with a position that can be challenged. The comedy does not allow this response because you cannot argue with a joke you are laughing at. You can argue with a joke after the fact, once you have recovered from the laughter and had time to consider what you were laughing at, but in the moment of the laugh, the content has already been received. It has already entered the audience's understanding of the world, delivered not through the front door of explicit assertion but through the side door of humor, and by the time the front brain defenses register that something has come in, it is already inside. This is why the show has outlasted every specific political controversy it has been connected to. It is why it has survived network pressure and merchandise controversies, and the loss of irreplaceable creative contributors, and the transition from one technological era to another. It is why it has maintained cultural relevance across 36 years, while most of the television it was contemporary with has faded from cultural memory. The Simpsons keeps going because the thing it is depicting has not changed. The structural principle by which concentrated power maintains itself through the specific kinds of damage it does to the people subject to it is as operative in 2025 as it was in 1989. The nuclear plant is still there. Burns is still there. Homer is still there. The conditions that produce them are still there. As long as those conditions persist, the show's portrait of them retains its relevance, and the comedy that delivers that portrait retains its capacity to make you laugh at exactly the thing you should probably be crying about instead. Homer reaches for a donut in a world that has systematically prevented him from reaching for anything better, and you laugh, and in your laughter is the whole history of what was done to him, and what he lost, and what Springfield is, and what America is, and what the show has been trying to tell you since the 17th of December, 1989. Lisa plays her saxophone in an empty hallway because the class expelled her for playing too well, and you watch her keep playing, and in that image is everything you need to know about what happens to intelligence in environments that cannot contain it, and about what you owe to yourself regardless of whether the environment acknowledges the debt. Maggie watches from her stroller, saying nothing, seeing everything, and in her silence is the most sophisticated strategic intelligence in Springfield, waiting for the moment she has decided only she will know about. Marge holds the family together one more time, with the specific patience that costs her something every time she extends it, and the cost is not acknowledged, and she extends it again because the family needs it, because the children need it, because Homer needs it in ways he cannot fully understand. And Burns runs the plant that poisons the town that produces the workers that run the plant. The loop is closed. The structure is self-sustaining. Nobody inside it can see the whole shape from inside it. Only the people outside it, watching it run, can see what it is. Which is us. The audience. The people watching. We can see it. The show has been showing it to us for 36 years. And if we have seen it, if we have received what the show has been sending across all those years and all those episodes and all those jokes that were also something more than jokes, then the question the show has always been implicitly asking finally arrives where it has always been heading. What are we going to do about it? The show does not answer this question. It cannot answer this question. It is a comedy, and comedies do not answer questions of that magnitude. They raise them, frame them, make them visible, deliver them through the side door in a form the audience can receive. What happens after that is not the show's job. That part belongs to us. Springfield will still be there when you come back. It always is. But you are here now, outside of it, in the real world, which is also Springfield, which is also yours to do something about. What happens next is up to you. Section 11. The Simpsons and the Mafia. There is a specific kind of joke that The Simpsons has been making since its third season that functions at two levels simultaneously, and that most viewers have been receiving at only one of them. At the accessible level, the joke is about organized crime as a comedic subject. The specific contrast between the mythology of the Mafia, as constructed by American popular culture, and the mundane reality of criminal organizations, as businesses that employ people with specific professional sensibilities and workplace concerns. At the deeper level, the joke is about Springfield itself, about the specific kind of community that makes organized crime not just tolerable but functionally necessary, about the relationship between legitimate institutional corruption and the illegitimate kind, and about the question of whether the distinction between the two is as clear as we prefer to imagine. The Simpsons' engagement with organized crime is more sustained and more sophisticated than most discussions of the show acknowledge. Fat Tony D'Amico is one of the longest-running recurring characters in the show's history, appearing in more than 30 episodes across the show's run. His first appearance was in Season 3, and the character has been consistently written and performed with more complexity than the simple mob boss caricature he initially appeared to be. Fat Tony, voiced by Joe Mantegna, is a criminal, and the show never obscures this. He runs criminal enterprises. He uses violence as a business tool. He operates in explicit defiance of the legal order. These things are not treated as admirable or as a source of uncomplicated comedy. But the character is also written as someone who thinks about his work, who has a specific professional philosophy, who draws distinctions between different kinds of criminal behavior based on criteria that have internal consistency, and who is, in certain respects, more reliable than the nominally legitimate institutions with which Springfield residents otherwise interact. This last quality is the most interesting and the most carefully observed. Fat Tony delivers on his commitments. When Homer enters a business relationship with Fat Tony, in the episode involving the sanitation department, Fat Tony's end of the arrangement is honored with a precision that the legitimate sanitation service never achieved. This is not a celebration of criminal business ethics. It is a satire of legitimate institutional failure, severe enough that its criminal alternative appears comparatively competent. The show keeps returning to this dynamic. The specific institutional failures of Springfield, which are many and deep, create spaces that criminal enterprises fill, not because criminal enterprises are more ethical, but because the legitimate institutions have failed to occupy those spaces effectively. This is an accurate observation about how organized crime actually functions in real communities, and the show makes it through comedy that is funny because it is precise. The history of real organized crime's intersection with American entertainment is long and complex and directly relevant to the show's comedic relationship to the subject, because the writers who created The Simpsons' mob content were writing in full awareness of that history. American popular culture's relationship to the mafia is not a simple one-way relationship in which culture depicts crime. It is a relationship in which cultural representations of crime shape how crime understands and presents itself, and in which criminal interests have, at various moments, shaped what cultural representations are available. The specific genre of mob comedy that The Simpsons participates in has a rich tradition in American humor, from the broad slapstick of the classic film era, through the more sophisticated treatments of the mid-20th century, through the post-Godfather era, when the romance of the mafia as a subject had been so thoroughly established that comedy could work against it productively. The Simpsons writers knew this tradition well and wrote their mob content in deliberate relationship to it. The Homie the Clown episode, in which Homer becomes mistaken for Krusty the Clown and finds himself navigating the consequences of Krusty's debt to the mob, is perhaps the most formally sophisticated piece of mob comedy the show produced. It works simultaneously as a pure comedic premise, as a parody of specific mob film conventions, and as an observation about the specific relationship between celebrity culture and criminal culture, the way fame provides a kind of insulation from certain consequences while making certain other consequences more intense. The episode also does something specifically interesting with Homer's cognitive limitations in the context of mob involvement. Homer does not understand the danger he is in for the entire duration of the episode. He processes the mob's interest in him through the same optimistic and reality-resistant cognitive framework he applies to everything, and his consistent misreading of threatening situations as benign produces a comedy of obliviousness that is also a study in how a specific kind of personality survives encounters with danger that would incapacitate a more aware individual. Homer survives mob encounters not because he is brave or smart or strategically capable. He survives them because the specific reality processing limitations that make him such a catastrophically bad nuclear safety inspector also make him constitutionally incapable of the fear response that a situation calls for. The mob figures in the show consistently find Homer's absence of appropriate fear disorienting. They are accustomed to operating in an environment where the implied threat of violence produces immediate behavioral compliance. Homer does not produce behavioral compliance because he does not register the implied threat, and his failure to register the implied threat means the mob's primary tool is unavailable, leaving them to improvise responses to a situation their normal operating procedure does not cover. This is an observation about a real dynamic in how power operates through threat, and about the specific kind of resistance to power that is available to people who cannot fully register what the power is threatening. Homer is not a hero. He does not resist the mob through courage. He resists it through cognitive limitation. But the resistance is real, and its source, while comic, is also genuinely interesting as a study in the relationship between consciousness and vulnerability. The show's most sustained engagement with the structural relationship between organized crime and legitimate institutions comes through the recurring dynamic between Fat Tony's operations and Chief Wiggum's law enforcement response to them, or rather, the absence of a law enforcement response. Fat Tony has operated in Springfield for the entire period of Wiggum's tenure as chief of police. His operations are not secret. They are conducted with a degree of visibility that would, in a functional law enforcement environment, produce regular arrests and prosecutions. The relationship between Fat Tony and the Springfield Police Department has never been fully explained in the show, but its existence as a non-prosecution relationship is so consistent that it cannot be accidental. Wiggum is aware of Fat Tony is aware of Wiggum. They have interacted in ways that establish mutual recognition, and Fat Tony continues to operate. This is the relationship that the show depicts most honestly and most precisely when it comes to organized crime's real position in American community life, which is the position of a tolerated parallel institution whose relationship to legitimate authority is managed through arrangements that neither side finds it useful to make explicit. The show has, on at least 2 occasions, depicted the mechanics of this arrangement with more specificity than the surface comedy requires. Both occasions involved situations in which the arrangement was temporarily disrupted, in which the normal operation of the mutual non-interference was complicated by external factors, and in which both parties had to navigate the consequences of the disruption, without being able to appeal to the arrangement that was being disrupted. These episodes are the most interesting in the show's organized crime catalog, precisely because they illuminate the arrangement by depicting what happens when it fails. The normal state of things in Springfield's organized crime ecosystem is a stable equilibrium, in which everyone with a stake in the equilibrium's maintenance has sufficient incentive to maintain it. When the equilibrium is disrupted, the specific nature of the arrangement becomes visible in the process of its restoration. Fat Tony's relationship to the rest of Springfield's power structure is one of the show's most underexamined threads. He is not Burns. He does not own the nuclear plant or the electrical grid. His power is more local, more direct, more dependent on the specific community relationships that his criminal enterprise has cultivated across its operational history. But his power, in certain specific registers, is more immediate and more responsive than Burns's, precisely because it is not mediated through the institutional structures that Burns operates through. When the Simpson family needs something that the legitimate institutional infrastructure cannot or will not provide, the criminal infrastructure has occasionally been the provider of last resort. This dynamic, which the show plays as comedy, is also an accurate portrait of the specific role that criminal organizations play in communities where legitimate institutions have failed specific populations consistently enough that the alternative has become normalized. The Simpsons does not endorse this dynamic. It does not present it as a solution. It presents it as a fact, a specific fact about how a specific kind of community manages the gap between what it needs and what its legitimate institutions deliver. And it presents it through comedy, which is both the most available format for this kind of observation and the most effective, because the comedy means the observation is received before the audience has fully processed what is being observed. Springfield has a mafia because Springfield has institutional failures severe enough to create a space for one. The mafia exists because the police do not effectively operate. The police do not effectively operate because the political system that oversees them has been captured. The political system has been captured because the economic power structure of the town is concentrated enough in a single entity to make capture straightforward. And the economic power structure is concentrated in that single entity because the entity in question has been accumulating and protecting that concentration for over a century through a combination of strategy, violence, and the specific institutional protections that concentrated wealth can purchase. The mafia in Springfield is not the cause of Springfield's problems. It is a symptom of them. It fills the space that legitimate institutions have vacated, and in filling that space, it participates in the same system that produced the space, sustaining the conditions that make it necessary rather than working against them, because working against them would be self-defeating. This is the actual argument of The Simpsons' organized crime content, stripped of the comedy that delivers it. It is an argument that would be resisted if made directly. Delivered through Fat Tony and Wiggum, and Homer's oblivious mob encounters, and the specific comedy of criminal enterprises operating with more professional reliability than the institutions they exist alongside, it is received as entertainment first and as observation second. But the observation is there. It has always been there. Fat Tony will appear in the next episode he is scheduled for, and he will make a specific reference to a specific criminal enterprise with a specific professional philosophy, and Chief Wiggum will fail to address it in a specific way, and Homer will misunderstand the situation in a specific way, and you will laugh, and somewhere in the laughter is everything the show has been trying to tell you about the relationship between institutional failure and the alternatives that institutional failure makes necessary. The comedy does not cover the content. The comedy is the delivery system. Section 12. The Writer's Room, the machine behind Springfield. Television is a collaborative art form in a way that film is not, and theater is not, and novels are not. When a novelist sits alone with a manuscript, every decision belongs to them. When a playwright finishes a script, the production will interpret and expand it, but the essential choices are already made. When a film director finishes principal photography, there is an extended process ahead, but the creative authority over that process is concentrated. Television writing, particularly the kind practiced by The Simpsons at its peak, is something different. It is industrial creativity, a system designed to produce enormous volumes of creative work by distributing the creative process across a team of people who spend more time together than they spend with their families. The Simpsons Writers' Room has been producing episodes for 36 seasons. The people who have worked in it across that time constitute a list that reads like a directory of American comedy's second half-century. Writers who left The Simpsons went on to create and run shows that defined subsequent decades of television. The show functioned in its peak years as something like a graduate school for a specific kind of intelligent, literate, formally ambitious comedy writing, and its alumni are visible throughout the comedy television landscape that followed. Understanding what happened in that room, how the specific process of making The Simpsons worked and changed over time, is essential for understanding what the show became and why it became that rather than something else. The table read is the first institutional moment in the production of any Simpsons episode, and it is the moment that most directly reflects the show's specific creative culture. In the table read, the complete cast assembles to read a script that has been written by specific writers but that, in the culture of The Simpsons Writers' Room, belongs to no one and therefore to everyone. Anyone can note that something is not working. Anyone can propose an alternative. The script that enters the table read and the script that emerges from it are often significantly different documents. This process requires a specific kind of ego management that not every talented writer can sustain. A writer who has spent weeks on a specific scene must be prepared to watch that scene undergo fundamental revision by a room full of people who are applying their own comedic sensibilities to material they did not produce. The scene that survives this process is better than the scene that entered it, in most cases, because 20 intelligent and funny people have applied themselves to the question of whether it is working, but the writer of the original scene may find parts of themselves in the revision, and other parts conspicuously absent. The specific culture of The Simpsons table read, which has been described by numerous alumni as unlike any other writer's room they have worked in, was shaped most directly by the show's early leaders. Sam Simon, in the first 3 seasons, established a culture of rigorous questioning that was not particularly comfortable for writers who were attached to their own work, but that produced exceptional material because the questioning was not about individual judgment, but about a shared standard that everyone in the room had accepted. The standard was simple to describe and extremely difficult to meet. The scene had to be funny, and it had to be true. Not documentary true. Character true. Homer had to behave in a way that was simultaneously Homer doing something funny and Homer doing the thing Homer would actually do in this specific situation. If the funny thing was not the Homer thing, you had to find the Homer thing that was also funny. And if you could not find it, you rewrote the scene until you did. This standard produced the specific quality that distinguishes peak Simpsons episodes from episodes that are merely funny. Peak Simpsons is funny, and it is also emotionally resonant in a way that funny alone cannot produce, because the comedy is generated by characters doing the things those characters would genuinely do, rather than doing the things that it is funny for characters to do. These overlap more than they differ, but where they diverge, the show at its best chose character truth over comedy convenience, and the comedy was better for it. Writers who came to the show after Simon's departure have described a gradual shift in this standard, not an abandonment of it, but a loosening. The show became more willing to have characters do funny things that were not precisely what those characters would do, because the characters were well enough established by that point that a degree of deviation from their established truth was tolerable without breaking the audience's relationship to them. Homer doing something that is funny but not quite Homer became acceptable in a way it had not been in the first 3 seasons. And this acceptance, which was rational given the show's developmental history, nonetheless marked a transition in the show's fundamental relationship to character truth that contributed to the qualitative differentiation between early and later seasons that casual viewers have observed and critics have debated. For decades, The Room's relationship to current events is one of the most interesting and most consistent elements of the show's production culture. The Simpsons has always had a policy, informal but consistent, of engaging with the world it is being made in. The specific political events, cultural moments, and public debates that are happening as writers are in the room, producing a given episode, find their way into that episode through a process that is partly deliberate and partly osmotic. Deliberate incorporation happens when the writers explicitly decide that a current situation provides material for a specific story or joke. The episode about a viral illness originating in Asia, which has since been discussed extensively in the context of COVID-19, was a deliberate engagement with the kind of fear-generating, institution-straining infectious disease event that was a recurring feature of contemporary public health experience. The writers wrote the episode they wrote because that kind of event was available to them as a cultural subject and because the specific anxieties it generated in the public were available to them as comedic material. Osmotic incorporation is less conscious. The writers are people who read the news, watch television, have conversations with their families and friends about the events of the moment, and are saturated with the cultural atmosphere of the period in which they are working. This saturation produces effects in their writing that they are not always aware of. Jokes that seem to come from nowhere but that, in retrospect, can be traced to a specific cultural conversation happening at the time they were written. Character behaviors that seem invented but that mirror in a distorted way the specific public behavioral patterns of a moment. The show is porous to the culture that produces it, and the porousness is not fully managed or deliberate. This is why the show functions as such an interesting historical document. Not because it was written as a historical document, but because it was so thoroughly saturated in the specific cultural moments of its production that it preserves aspects of those moments that more deliberate historical records do not. The specific anxieties, the specific jokes, the specific cultural conversations. The Simpsons is an archive of 36 years of American cultural life, preserved in amber by the specific act of being saturated with it and then fixed in broadcast. The role of the showrunner, the person who holds ultimate creative authority over any given season, is the variable that has changed most visibly across the show's history, and that has produced the most directly traceable effects on the show's quality and character. Al Jean, who has run the show for an extraordinary span of its history, is the most consequential single figure in The Simpsons' administrative creative history after the founding generation. His tenure has been characterized by a consistent set of priorities that are visible in the shows produced under his authority: a preference for narrative coherence within individual episodes, a tolerance for serialized elements that his predecessors had generally avoided, a specific relationship to the show's canonical history that neither fully honors it nor fully ignores it, but that treats it as available material to be engaged with selectively. Under Gene's leadership, the show has produced some of its best late-period episodes, alongside some of its most inconsistent work, and the inconsistency is at least partly a function of the specific challenges of running a show for as long as he has been running it. The creative challenges of producing great television after 35 seasons of producing television are not the same challenges as the creative challenges of producing great television in year 3. The audience knows the characters so well that any deviation from their established truth is felt immediately. The show has done so many things that the available space for genuinely new situations is genuinely smaller. The standards against which any new work is measured include the show's own extraordinary peaks, which is an exceptionally demanding comparative standard. Gene has navigated these challenges with more success than most observers predicted would be possible, And the late period episodes that succeed do so by finding stories and situations that are genuinely new within the established world while being unmistakably Simpsons in their specific character. These episodes exist. They are produced regularly enough to sustain the argument that the show has not completely lost what it had. They are produced less regularly than the earlier peaks, which sustains the argument that something has changed. Both arguments are correct, and their coexistence is simply the condition of a show that has been producing episodes for 36 years. The writer's room of The Simpsons is a machine for producing comedy at industrial volume without losing the quality that distinguishes great comedy from professional comedy. The machine has been running for 36 seasons. The machine has been maintained, modified, and sometimes significantly rebuilt during that time. The people who run it are not the same people who built it. The institutional culture that governs it is not identical to the institutional culture of its earliest seasons, but it is still running. Every season, writers come into the room. Scripts are produced, table reads happen, episodes are made, episodes air. 36 seasons of this process have produced a body of work that, taken as a whole, constitutes one of the most significant creative achievements in the history of American commercial entertainment. The machine is not the genius of the machine's operators. It is the accumulated intelligence of every person who has worked in it, every institutional norm they established, every creative standard they set and then met and then revised upward, and every episode they produced that was better than the episodes that came before it, and that therefore reset the standard against which the next episode would be measured. That is what a writer's room is, at its best. A machine for making the next thing better than the last thing, sustained by a culture that values the making as much as the product of the making, and that treats the creative standard as a living thing that must be maintained through constant application, rather than a settled thing that was established once and can now simply be referenced. The Simpsons writer's room has been, at its best, exactly this, and the episodes it produced at its best are the proof. Section 13. The music of Springfield, Danny Elfman, and the sound that defines a world. Before the first image of Springfield settled on a television screen, before Homer walked out of the nuclear plant, before Bart put chalk to the blackboard, there was the music. A single melodic phrase, announced with the precision and deliberate effect of a theatrical overture, establishing not just an atmosphere but a world. Danny Elfman wrote the Simpsons theme in a single day, and what he produced in that day has played at the beginning of nearly 800 episodes and has become one of the most immediately recognizable pieces of music in the history of popular entertainment. The specific qualities of the Simpsons theme, the mixture of musical sophistication and genuine warmth, the slightly off-kilter harmonic choices that feel whimsical but are in fact precisely calculated, the way the melody manages to suggest both satire and affection simultaneously are not accidental. They are the result of a specific musical intelligence applied to a specific creative problem. Elfman's brief from Matt Groening was something in the range of fun, dynamic, slightly weird. The brief for a children's show theme or a family show theme in 1989 would typically produce either something overtly playful and simple, a children's cartoon sound, or something that suggested adult entertainment values through sophistication and distance. Elfman produced neither. What he produced was a theme that worked in both registers without fully committing to either, that was sophisticated enough to be taken seriously and warm enough to be loved, and that was specifically not the sound of anything that had existed before it. The orchestration of the theme is its most formally interesting element. Elfman uses a specific combination of instrument types and specific performance approaches within those types to produce a sound that is identifiably orchestral, but that does not feel like the classical orchestral tradition in the way that most orchestrated television themes do. The harps and bells and the specific use of the choir in the opening phrase create an expectation that the theme is going to resolve in a particular way, and then the main melodic statement arrives in a different register with a different energy than the opening promised, and the gap between the promise and the delivery is where the specific character of the theme lies. The theme has been recorded in different arrangements across the show's history. The basic melodic content has been consistent, but the specific orchestration has been adjusted for different seasons, and the differences between those arrangements, while subtle, are audible to listeners who have been paying close attention across decades of regular viewing. The early season arrangements feel slightly different from the arrangements of later seasons in ways that are not primarily about musical quality but about musical character, about the specific decisions made and how to realize the same melodic content with the same general instrumentation. Alf Clausen was the primary composer for The Simpsons for 27 seasons, producing original music for nearly every episode across that span. The volume and consistency of his contribution is staggering when you try to comprehend it as a creative output. Simpsons episodes are music-heavy. The show uses original underscore, original songs, and original parody arrangements in quantities that most television productions cannot approach. Each episode requires composition, arrangement, recording, and editing. Across 27 seasons, the total body of original Simpsons music produced under Clausen's direction constitutes one of the largest bodies of original composition in television history. The songs are the element of Clausen's contribution that are most frequently discussed and most publicly celebrated, and the discussion is warranted because the songs are remarkable. The Simpsons has produced songs in virtually every genre of popular and classical music, parodies and originals, and has done so at a consistent level of craft that distinguishes the show's musical output from the musical output of any comparable television production. The Planet of the Apes musical sequence from the episode A Fish Called Selma is perhaps the most formally accomplished piece of comedic song the show ever produced. The song, which Phil Hartman's Troy McClure performs in a full production number, parodies the specific conventions of Broadway musical adaptation of non-musical source material with the kind of precision that requires both an intimate knowledge of what is being parodied and a genuine affection for the form being parodied. The song is funny because it is accurate. It captures exactly what a Broadway adaptation of Planet of the Apes would sound like, constructed the specific way Broadway musical adaptations of unlikely source material are constructed, with exactly the musical choices a composer working in that tradition and those constraints would make. This is the specific quality of the best Simpsons music. It is not just parody in the sense of borrowing surface features and distorting them for comedic effect. It is parody in the sense of understanding the structural logic of what it is parodying and then reproducing that logic in a context that illuminates it through juxtaposition. The Planet of the Apes song is funny because you recognize it. Not because you recognize Planet of the Apes specifically, but because you recognize the type of Broadway adaptation it represents. You have heard shows that work this way. You know the musical language. The song makes that language visible by applying it to the most improbable possible subject, and in making it visible, it makes the language itself the joke. Clausen's departure from the show after season 27 was another of the show's significant losses, and like Hartman's death and the retirements of Edna and Troy and Hutz, it produced a qualitative change in what the show sounded like that is audible but difficult to specify precisely. The show continued with different musical direction. The episodes continued to contain music. The music continued to be competent. But the specific character of The Simpsons underscore that Clausen had established across 27 seasons of consistent application was gone, replaced by something that was different in specific ways that longtime listeners register without always being able to articulate. The specific way a piece of underscore begins in a Clausen-era episode is different from the way underscore begins in a post-Clausen episode. The harmonic language is different. The rhythmic approach to pacing emotional beats is different. The specific instrumentation choices for specific types of scenes are different. None of these differences make the post-Clausen music bad. They make it different. And after 27 seasons, different sounds wrong to ears that have been calibrated to the specific sound that was right. The show's relationship to popular music is one of the consistent elements of its cultural engagement that has produced some of its most interesting content. The Simpsons has featured original music by an extraordinary range of performers across its history, from classical performers to rock legends, to hip-hop artists, to country performers, to singers operating in genres that did not exist in 1989 and that the show has incorporated as they emerged. Each of these appearances reflects the show's specific relationship to that genre and that performer at the moment of the appearance, and the appearances collectively constitute a kind of musical history of American popular culture across the same 36 years that the show has been running. The specific context in which a performer appears on The Simpsons is almost always a slightly satirical framing. The show does not simply feature performers as themselves doing their thing. It places them in situations that comment on some element of their public persona or their relationship to the specific cultural context they represent. The satirical framing is generally gentle, The show's relationship to the musical guests it features is almost always affectionate rather than critical. But the framing is there, and it produces a specific kind of entertainment that is different from a straightforward musical performance, and that is more interesting, precisely because of the friction between the performer's presence and the context the show places them in. The music of Springfield is the element of the show most thoroughly experienced without conscious attention. You hear it and it produces its effects without your being actively aware that you are hearing it. The underscore guides your emotional response to scenes in ways that you would not predict from description alone. The songs embed themselves in memory with a persistence that exceeds the persistence of specific episodes. The theme announces Springfield with such consistency and such accumulated association that it triggers recognition and warmth before a single frame of the episode has been seen. This is music doing its specific work, the work of emotional architecture, of preparation and guidance and reflection, the work that is invisible precisely because it is successful. Danny Elfman wrote a theme in a single day that has been preparing audiences for Springfield for 36 years. Alf Clausen wrote music for 27 seasons that shaped the emotional experience of every episode he scored. The music of The Simpsons has been as essential to what the show is as the writing, the animation, and the voice performances. It has simply been doing its work more quietly than those other elements, which is the specific invisibility of music's greatest success. Section 14. Springfield's Hidden Architecture. The buildings that tell stories. Every building in Springfield was designed for reasons that extend beyond simple visual necessity. The specific architecture of the Simpsons house, the nuclear plant, the school, the church, Moe's Tavern, and the dozens of other recurring locations in Springfield's geography is not random, not simply the result of animators making quick choices about what places should look like. Each location was built, in its specific visual character, to reflect the specific thematic weight it carries in the show's narrative. The Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace is the most analyzed building in fictional American architecture, not because it is architecturally interesting in the conventional sense, but because it is precisely calibrated to represent a specific American domestic aspiration at a specific historical moment. The house is big enough, not large, not impressive, not the kind of house that signals success to the outside world, but big enough. It has enough rooms for each family member to have a space. It has a garage. It has a backyard. It has the basic physical structure of the middle-class American family home as it existed in the cultural imagination of 1989. The house does not look aspirational. It looks adequate. This is precise. The house is exactly what Homer's income at the nuclear plant can sustain with Marge managing the household budget. It is not a reward for success. It is the baseline that a nuclear power plant safety inspector can maintain. The house is the floor of the middle class, the minimum physical expression of having arrived at the American standard, and it wears its adequacy visibly. The interior of the house is defined by the couch in the living room, which is not the most impressive piece of furniture in an impressive room, but the central gathering point of a family that is constantly scattered and constantly reconverging. The couch is where the family watches television, which is to say, it is where the family exists as a family, together in the same space, doing the specific thing that the American family of 1989 did together. The couch is the altar of the Simpson religion, which is the religion of domestic normalcy, of being in the same room at the end of the day, of the television as a mediating presence that makes shared space comfortable without requiring active engagement. This is a very specific cultural observation about the American family that the couch gag, which always ends with the family on the couch watching television, enacts rather than states. Every episode of The Simpsons ends, structurally, where it begins, on the couch in front of the television. The family is always returning to this position. Whatever happens in the episode, the couch is where they always come back to. The American family does not gather around the fire or the dinner table or the stoop. It gathers around the television. And the couch is where you sit to watch the television. And this is home. The nuclear plant is architecturally important for exactly opposite reasons. It is the most prominent building in Springfield's skyline, visible from virtually every outdoor location in any episode that depicts the town at any distance. Its cooling towers are the visual signature of Springfield, the way that distinctive skyline elements are the visual signatures of real cities. The plant dominates the horizon of Springfield, the way that major economic institutions dominate the actual horizons of the real places they define. This is an architectural statement about economic power and its visual expression. The plant is the most important building in Springfield, not because it is the most beautiful or the most institutionally significant in terms of civic function, but because it generates the economic activity that the rest of Springfield depends on. The cooling towers are the architectural expression of this dependency, visible from everywhere in the town, a constant visual reminder of what the town is organized around. The specific visual character of the plant, industrial, slightly menacing, its cooling towers the universal symbol of nuclear energy's specific visual language, is also an architectural statement about what kind of economic activity is at the center of Springfield's existence. Not manufacturing, not commerce, not civic institution. Nuclear energy, with its specific associations of invisible danger and awesome power and institutional scale that exceeds the scale of ordinary life. The nuclear plant looks the way it looks because it needs to be legible as what it is, from every angle at every distance. And what it is, in the show's architectural grammar, is the organizing principle of Springfield's existence, the thing that everything else in the town is organized around and dependent on, and that nobody in the town is fully comfortable looking at directly. Moe's Tavern is architecturally the opposite of aspirational, in a way that goes beyond simple shabbiness. The visual character of the tavern has been consistent across 36 seasons: dark, cramped, surfaces that suggest decades of accumulated use that have not been cleaned so much as overlaid with new layers of use, the specific aesthetic of a place that has been exactly what it is for so long that the question of what it should be has simply stopped being asked. The tavern's visual character reflects Moe's specific relationship to his own enterprise, which is the relationship of a man who has not invested in the aspiration of his establishment because investing would imply belief in a future in which the investment would be worth making. Moe has no such belief. Moe operates the tavern the way the tavern is, because the tavern has always been this way, and changing it would be the kind of hope that Moe has specifically protected himself against through decades of practiced resignation. This is an architecture that is a character study. The tavern looks the way it looks because Moe is who Moe is, and Moe is who Moe is partly because of the tavern. The relationship between the person and the space they inhabit is circular, self-reinforcing, neither fully cause nor fully effect, but both simultaneously. Springfield Elementary School is architecturally the most institutionally specific building in the show's visual vocabulary. It looks exactly like what it is: a public school built at a specific moment in American educational infrastructure history, maintained at the minimum level required to prevent legal liability, neither aesthetically improved nor fundamentally degraded since the day of its construction. It looks the way most American public schools look, which is to say it looks like a building that was not designed to be inspiring and has achieved that goal completely. The school's architecture is a statement about how seriously Springfield takes the education of its children, which is to say it is a statement about the relationship between public investment and public priority. The building that houses Burns's power plant is the most imposing in Springfield. The building that houses Springfield's children for the first 12 years of their educational lives looks like a maintenance obligation barely met. This gap between the architectural investment in the economic infrastructure that benefits private interests and the architectural investment in the public infrastructure that serves the community is visible in every shot of the Springfield skyline. The show does not comment on this gap explicitly. It simply shows you the skyline consistently across 36 years, and the skyline is the comment. The First Church of Springfield is architecturally interesting precisely because it is the most conventional building in the town. Where everything else in Springfield's visual vocabulary is slightly off, slightly more or less than you would expect, the church looks exactly like a church. This is not an accident. The church, being the most visually normative building in Springfield, is an architectural statement about the specific relationship between religious institution and cultural expectation in American life, where the church is so thoroughly embedded in the visual grammar of community that it appears natural even when everything around it appears strange. Reverend Lovejoy's relationship to his congregation, his exhaustion with the specific demands that genuine pastoral care would make, his preference for the administrative and ritualistic dimensions of ministry over its spiritually substantive dimensions, is a character study that the building's studied conventionality supports. The church looks right because the church is doing what churches do. It is just not doing what churches are supposed to do. The building is perfect. The institution inside it has arrived at a settled relationship with its own inadequacy. The architecture of Springfield is, collectively, the most consistent visual argument the show makes about the relationship between physical environment and social reality. The buildings are not background. They are evidence. Each one, in its specific visual character, tells you something specific about the social reality of the space it occupies, and about the relationship between that space and the town that contains it. Springfield is a place you can read, if you know the language. The language is architecture, and the architecture has been saying specific things about Springfield for 36 years, in every exterior shot and every establishing frame, consistently and without variation, waiting to be read by the viewer who has developed enough fluency to receive what it is saying. Section 15. Treehouse of Horror. The mirror Springfield holds up to itself. Every October, The Simpsons does something that the rest of its season does not do. It stops being The Simpsons and becomes something else, an anthology of horror stories, dark fables, and genre experiments that are collected under the umbrella of the Treehouse of Horror special. These specials occupy a unique position in the show's history because they are simultaneously the episodes that generate the most audience enthusiasm and the episodes that are most thoroughly misunderstood in terms of what they are actually doing. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are not simply fun diversions from the show's normal format. They are the show's most direct engagement with its own darkest implications, using the permission structure of the horror genre and the explicit framing of non-canonical stories to say things that the regular episode format cannot say. The horror genre has always been the genre most willing to follow its premises to their logical conclusions. Where other genres pull back from the fully worked-out implications of their setups, horror tends to proceed. What would it actually mean if this specific terrible thing happened? The horror story follows that question further than other genres do, and in following it, it illuminates aspects of the human situation that gentler genres leave in shadow. The Simpsons' regular episodes live in the space where the terrible things almost happen or happen partially and then reset. Homer almost dies. Springfield almost ends. The nuclear plant almost melts down. The premise is visited and the consequences are glimpsed, and then the episode ends and everything is fine. This is the show's fundamental relationship to its own darkness. It approaches the darkness and then retreats. The Treehouse of Horror specials do not retreat. In these episodes, Homer dies, Bart dies, Springfield is destroyed, aliens conquer, demons collect. The logical conclusions of dark premises are pursued to their ends, and because the specials are explicitly framed as non-canonical, the pursuit does not have consequences that carry forward. The show can let the darkness go all the way because the darkness will not be there next week. This permission structure produces episodes that are more formally ambitious than the regular episodes, and that explore the show's thematic content more directly than the regular episodes can. The first segment of the very first Treehouse of Horror, in which the house on Evergreen Terrace itself is revealed to be a malevolent entity, is not just a horror parody. It is an observation about the American home as a hostile environment dressed as a horror parody. The house has always been trying to kill the family. The regular episodes pretend this is not true. The Treehouse of Horror segment lets it be true. Across 35 Treehouse of Horror specials, the show has used the horror framework to engage with almost every significant anxiety that the regular episodes circle but do not fully address. Death, the nuclear plant's actual consequences, the specific horror of immortality, the question of what burns actually is when you remove the protections that social convention provides, the specific implications of a town that cannot age and cannot change and cannot process consequence. The Shining segment, a parody of The Shining that is also a perfectly executed short story in its own right, uses the horror premise to say something specific about Homer's relationship to his family and about what happens when the mediating structures that keep Homer's worst impulses in check are removed. Without television and beer, Homer becomes something specific, not a monster in the generic horror sense. A very specific kind of man, a man whose love for his family is genuine but whose internal regulation is insufficient to manage the pressures that accumulate when the management strategies fail. This is what The Shining is about in its original form, and it is what The Shining is about in its parody form. The specific horror of the person you love becoming a threat. The specific horror of love and danger residing in the same person. The parody gets the joke and the original point simultaneously. The most interesting recurring element of the Treehouse of Horror segments is the treatment of death. In the regular episodes, death is extremely rare and extremely significant when it occurs. Characters who die stay dead with real consequence. Maud Flanders, Edna Krabappel, Frank Grimes, with exceptions for characters whose deaths turned out to be mistakes or hoaxes. The weight of death in the regular episodes reflects the weight the show gives to consequence generally. In the Treehouse of Horror episodes, characters die constantly, multiple times per segment, with complete comedic abandon. Homer dies, Bart dies, the family dies collectively. Death is the punchline, the setup, the dramatic climax, and the reset mechanism simultaneously. And in their treatment of death as something that can happen without consequence because it is happening in a non-canonical frame, the Treehouse of Horror episodes illuminate something about the regular episodes by contrast. The regular episode's treatment of death is meaningful partly because death is rare. If Homer died every episode, Homer's specific near-death experiences in the regular episodes would not land with the same weight. The Treehouse of Horror specials exist, partly, to be the space where death means nothing, so that the regular episodes can be the space where death means something. They define each other by contrast. The horror parodies themselves have evolved considerably across 35 specials. The early Treehouse of Horror episodes were primarily engaged with specific well-known horror films and stories, adapting and parodying specific texts in ways that rewarded audience familiarity with the source material. The Shining, The Raven, The Fly, Nightmare on Elm Street. The engagement was primarily at the level of the text being parodied. The later specials have become more interested in horror as a formal mode and less interested in specific horror texts. They use horror conventions, the genre's specific relationship to dread and anticipation and revelation, as a language for exploring ideas that are not exclusively horror ideas. A segment about automation and its implications for human labor is not a horror parody in the conventional sense, but it is using horror formal elements, the sense of threat building to inevitable catastrophe, the specific helplessness of characters who can see what is coming and cannot prevent it, to make a point about a real social anxiety that the regular show circles but does not land on directly. This evolution reflects the show's development of its relationship to the Treehouse of Horror format. What began as a Halloween stunt, a one-time seasonal special that the audience found unexpectedly compelling, and that therefore became annual, has developed into the show's most formally ambitious vehicle. Not a departure from what The Simpsons is, but an extension of it into the territory that the regular format leaves to implication. The Treehouse of Horror specials are where The Simpsons lets itself be as dark as the rest of the show implies, but never quite commits to. They are the show's shadow, its acknowledgement that Springfield, for all its comedy and warmth and emotional resonance, is also a place where terrible things are always almost happening, and where the permission to let them actually happen produces the most honest engagement with what the place is. Every October, Springfield does what it cannot do in any other month. It follows its darkness all the way down. And every November, it comes back to where it always was, on the couch, watching television, as if nothing happened. Because in Springfield, that is how everything ends, and also how it begins again. Section 16. The show that outlived the culture that made it. There is a category of creative work that becomes genuinely more interesting the longer it runs, not because it gets better across time in a simple progression, but because the relationship between the work and the world, it was made and changes as that world changes and the work continues. The work that was made in a specific cultural moment, and that was, in that moment, a response to that moment, becomes in subsequent moments a record of that moment, and in becoming a record, it becomes something different from what it was. The Simpsons began in 1989, which means it began at a specific moment in American cultural and political history that is now more than 30 years past. The America of 1989 is, in important respects, a different country from the America of 2025. Different in its economic conditions, different in its political arrangements, different in its technological environment, different in its cultural texture and its public discourse, and its sense of its own identity and trajectory. The show that was a precise satirical response to the America of 1989 has continued to be made through all of the changes that have transformed the country it was responding to. It has adapted to these changes, incorporated them, engaged with them, been shaped by them. but it has also carried the residue of what it was in 1989 through all of the subsequent years, and the accumulation of that residue, the way the show of 2025 contains within it the show of 1989 and every year between, is the most interesting formal property of a 36-year creative project. When you watch an early Simpsons episode in 2025, you are not just watching a story about the Simpson family. You are watching a document, a record of a specific moment in American life, in American comedy, in American culture, in the specific conversation that American popular culture was having with itself in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The specific jokes are funnier if you understand the specific targets they were aimed at, and those targets have in many cases receded from current cultural awareness into historical record. The show knew this was happening. Not in the early seasons, when the shows being referenced were current and the satirical targets were immediate, but in later seasons, when the show began to engage with its own historical record, when episodes set in the present began to reference earlier seasons as historical context, when the specific cultural moment of the show's beginning became the historical past that later episodes were looking back at, the show became aware of its own historical existence and began to incorporate that awareness. This is a strange position for a piece of entertainment to occupy. Most entertainment is designed for its moment of production. It is trying to be relevant now, to speak to the conditions of its specific present. When those conditions change, most entertainment becomes dated, and dated entertainment loses its capacity to speak to the new conditions. It becomes a period piece, interesting as a record but no longer operative as a current intervention. The Simpsons has done something that most entertainment cannot do. It has continued to be current, at least partially, while also becoming historical. The show is both a document of 1989 and a producer of new content in 2025. It exists in multiple temporalities simultaneously, and its audience's experience of it shifts depending on which temporal layer they are engaging with. A viewer who has been watching the show since 1989 experiences early episodes as a kind of time travel. The show takes them back to a specific moment in their own life that is associated with the specific cultural moment the show was reflecting. This is a particularly powerful form of nostalgic experience because it is not just personal nostalgia but cultural nostalgia. The sense of being returned not just to a personal past, but to a shared cultural past that the show embodies. A viewer who encountered the show first in the 2010s or 2020s experiences the early episodes differently. For them, the early episodes are history, artifacts of a period before their own cultural formation. They are interesting not as nostalgia, but as archaeology, as evidence of what the culture was before the viewer's own experience of culture began. These different temporal experiences of the same show produce very different relationships to it, and the show, which was not designed to accommodate multiple temporal experiences simultaneously, has nonetheless become a text that is capable of being read in these multiple ways. The accumulation of 36 years of production has created a text complex enough to sustain multiple readings from multiple temporal positions. The show that outlived the culture that made it is a strange thing to be. It requires continual adaptation without losing the specific character that made it worth adapting. It requires engaging with new cultural moments without abandoning the accumulated history of previous cultural moments. It requires being current and historical simultaneously, appealing to people who have been watching since the beginning and to people who are discovering it now, serving both audiences without fully optimizing for either. No show in television history has navigated this position for as long as The Simpsons has navigated it. The show has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. It will probably continue to run after some of its current audience has died. It has become an institution in the fullest sense of the word, a thing that exists independent of any specific moment of production, that has a continuous existence across multiple generations of cultural life, that belongs to the culture rather than to any specific cultural moment. This is an unusual thing for a piece of entertainment to become, and it produces, in the watching of it, a specific experience that is different from the experience of watching entertainment that belongs to its moment. When you watch The Simpsons in 2025, you are watching something that was made in your present and also something that was made in a past that your present contains. Both experiences are available in the same episode. The show is happening now, and it is also always already having happened. It is current, and it is history, and it is both simultaneously. This is the strangest thing the show has accomplished, And it is the thing that nobody planned for and nobody could have planned for, because it is the product of time and survival, and the specific accident of a work being good enough to continue and continuing long enough to accumulate the particular density of existence that produces it. Springfield is a place you can visit at multiple points in its history in the same sitting. The show is a document of every moment it has been making, and all of those moments are available in the same archive. That is what 36 seasons means. Not just a number, not just a record. A specific kind of existence that no other piece of entertainment has achieved in the same degree, in the same form, in the same specific relationship to its own historical accumulation. The Simpsons outlived the culture that made it, and in outliving it, became the record of it. And in becoming the record, became something new. Not just a show, an archive, not just entertainment, evidence, not just Springfield. A version of America that is still running, still processing, still making episodes in 2025 about conditions that first appeared in 1989, still finding what there is to say about the family on Evergreen Terrace and the town around them and the country around the town. The loop is still floating. The family is still on the couch. Springfield is still out there, and we are still watching. Section 17. The guest stars who changed what Springfield could be. The Simpsons has featured more celebrity guest appearances than any other scripted television program in history. This is a number that requires context to be fully understood. Most television shows feature occasional celebrity appearances, crossover moments, or stunt casting for specific episodes. The Simpsons has been doing this continuously for 36 seasons, at a rate that, by the mid-1990s, had made the guest appearance a structural feature of the show's format rather than a special event. The numbers are staggering when you try to compile them. More than 700 guest voices have appeared in the show across its history. Actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, scientists, authors, comedians, public figures of every conceivable kind. Presidents and Nobel laureates and rock legends and professional athletes and cultural icons from every field of American public life. The Simpsons guest list is not just extensive. It is a comprehensive document of American celebrity culture across 3.5 decades. But the meaning of the guest list is not in its comprehensiveness. The meaning is in the specific relationship between the show's treatment of its guests and the show's relationship to celebrity culture generally. The Simpsons has always had a specific approach to celebrity that distinguishes its guest appearances from the typical television celebrity cameo. In most television cameos, the celebrity appears as themselves doing the thing that the celebrity is famous for, in a context that allows the regular characters to react to the celebrity's presence with appropriate awe. The cameo serves the celebrity's public image. It is, in substance, an endorsement. Look who likes our show enough to appear on it, and look how our characters respond to them. The Simpsons' approach to celebrity is almost entirely different. In the vast majority of guest appearances, the celebrity is playing a version of themselves that the show has subjected to a satirical reframing. The celebrity's public image, their reputation, their specific relationship to the cultural phenomena they represent, becomes the material for the comedic engagement. The show does not present the celebrity as someone the characters should be awed by. It presents them as someone whose specific cultural position is interesting enough to examine in a comedic context. Michael Jackson's appearance in Season 3 is the most famous and now the most complicated guest appearance in the show's history, and it repays close attention for what it reveals about the show's specific approach to celebrity. Jackson appeared under a pseudonym, credited as John J. Smith, performing the voice of a character who is clearly intended to be understood as Michael Jackson, despite the character being officially a large white man who merely believes he is Michael Jackson. This layer of deniability, the pseudonym, the official story that the character is not Jackson but is merely someone who thinks they are Jackson, was part of the episode's specific satirical strategy. The show was engaging with a celebrity who was, at the time of the episode's production, undergoing a specific kind of public examination, a scrutiny of the relationship between the extraordinary public persona and whatever the private person might be. The episode uses the conceit of the character who believes himself to be Jackson to examine the relationship between performance and identity, between the persona and the person, in a way that the show could not have examined if the guest appearance were simply Michael Jackson appearing as Michael Jackson. The episode was pulled from rotation in 2019, following the release of the Leaving Neverland documentary, a decision that reflected the show's willingness to reconsider the legacy of a guest appearance in light of changed understanding of the guest. This is an unusual thing for a television show to do. Archive decisions of this kind are rare. The pulling of the episode, whatever you think of the specific decision, demonstrates a specific quality of the show's relationship to its own history. A willingness to acknowledge that what seemed unambiguous in 1991 may be complicated in 2019, and to act on that acknowledgement, even when acting on it means removing something from an archive rather than adding something to it. The political guest appearances constitute a separate category with their own specific character. Multiple sitting presidents have been referenced or voiced or depicted in the show across its history. The show's relationship to presidential figures reflects its broader political sensibility. Engaged, satirical, fundamentally skeptical of the institutions these figures represent, without being dismissive of the individuals within them. The Bush family's relationship to the show is one of the most interesting political celebrity relationships in the show's history, precisely because it is explicitly adversarial in a way that most celebrity show relationships are not. George H.W. Bush's Walton speech, which we discussed earlier, produced a response that was both immediate and specific. The episode that followed depicted the family dealing directly with the Bush as neighbors, a premise that allowed the show to engage in extended, direct satirical commentary on the specific relationship between an administration whose values it found to be in conflict with the values the show actually represented, and the working-class family whose interests those administration values claim to serve. But the Bush family also gave the show something more complicated than simple antagonism. The adversarial relationship, the fact that the sitting president of the United States had chosen to attack The Simpsons by name in a public speech, gave the show a cultural position that could not have been purchased or manufactured. When the president attacks you, you are no longer just entertainment. You become something more interesting. You become the thing the powerful are afraid of, which is a specific kind of cultural authority that The Simpsons had not previously claimed for itself. The show was smart enough to understand this and to respond with something more precise than simple counterattack. The episode that featured the Bush-Simpson neighbor conflict was not primarily an attack on Bush. It was an examination of the relationship between political power and ordinary American life, using the specific premise of the most powerful political figure in the country as a literal neighbor of the most ordinary American family in television. The comedy of scale, of putting these two things into direct contact, was more interesting than any specific satirical point about the Bush themselves. The musician guest appearances are the most consistently successful in terms of producing episodes that transcend the category of celebrity cameo and achieve something with genuine artistic substance. This is partly a function of the specific match between what the show does and what musicians bring to a guest appearance. Musicians who appear on The Simpsons are typically allowed to perform. The performance, embedded in a narrative context that the show's writers have developed with specific care, produces something that is simultaneously entertainment and cultural commentary. The show does not just use musicians as visual presence or vocal cameo. It uses the specific cultural position of the musician, the specific relationship between the performer and the genre they represent and the audience that genre has built, as material for a comedic engagement that illuminates something about both the performer and the cultural space they occupy. The Spinal Tap appearance is perhaps the most formally perfect of the musician guest appearances, though Spinal Tap's specific status as a fictional band playing themselves in a fictional context already complicates what a guest appearance means. The episode uses the premise of a has-been band trying to regain relevance by attaching themselves to a town nobody has heard of in a way that is both a perfect satire of a specific moment in Spinal Tap's real fictional history and a perfect observation about the specific mechanics of cultural comeback attempts generally. The show has had genuine relationships with several major musical figures that extended beyond single-episode appearances, relationships in which the musicians became recurring presences in Springfield, in ways that acknowledge the relationship between the show's cultural world and the musicians' cultural world, as genuinely connected rather than simply adjacent. These relationships have produced some of the most interesting musical content in the show's history, content that uses the specific knowledge each musician brings to their appearance to say something about their specific cultural position that would not be available if the appearance were simply a cameo. The guest appearance tradition has changed across the show's history in ways that reflect broader changes in both the celebrity landscape and the show's relationship to it. Early guest appearances were relatively rare and were treated as special events within specific episodes. As the tradition became more established and more expected, the guest appearance became a more routine element of the show's structure, and the specific creative challenge of doing something interesting with the guest became both more important and harder to sustain at consistent quality. Later period guest appearances have been more likely to simply use the celebrity as a vocal presence in a role that any competent performer could fill, without the specific satirical engagement with the celebrity's cultural position that distinguishes the show's best guest work. This is a natural consequence of the tradition's maturation. What was initially a creative challenge became a format expectation, and format expectations tend to produce more mechanical responses than creative challenges do. But the best of the show's guest appearances, across the full history of the tradition, constitute a specific kind of cultural document. They are the points in the show's history where Springfield opened its borders to the actual culture that was producing it, where the fictional world and the real world made direct contact, and where the contact produced something that illuminated both worlds through juxtaposition. The guests that changed what Springfield could be were the ones who brought something from outside that the show's own internal resources could not have generated, and whose presence produced episodes that were genuinely new in ways that the regular production cycle does not always make possible. Those episodes are scattered across 36 seasons of production. They are not evenly distributed. They are not predictable. They appear when the right guest, in the right episode, with the right creative engagement, produces something that exceeds what any of the individual components could have produced alone. That is what the best guest appearances do. They prove that Springfield, despite being a fictional world built by a specific set of people in a specific set of conditions, is porous enough to admit the real world, and that when the real world enters, Springfield becomes more interesting than it was before the door opened. Section 18. Springfield's economy, the hidden financial logic of an impossible town. Springfield has an economy. This is not a trivial observation. Most fictional settings do not have economies in any meaningful sense. They have the economic backdrop required to establish characters' circumstances and to provide narrative context for specific plot elements, but the underlying financial logic of the setting is not worked through in any systematic way. You do not think about how the economy of the fictional town in a standard sitcom works, because you do not need to. The economy is there when the narrative requires it and absent when the narrative does not. The Simpsons has always been unusually interested in the economic dimensions of Springfield's existence. This is partly a consequence of the show's satirical project, which is explicitly concerned with the relationship between economic power and the lives of people who do not have it. But it is also a consequence of the specific way the show was built, with writers who had strong intellectual interests in economics and in the sociology of class, and who brought those interests to bear on the construction of Springfield's world. The foundational economic fact of Springfield is the nuclear power plant, which we have already discussed at length in the context of the radiation theory and the Burns mythology. But the plant's economic function, separate from its environmental function, is also worth examining. The plant is Springfield's primary employer and Springfield's primary source of electrical power. In a town of Springfield's size, with Springfield's economic profile, this concentration of economic function in a single privately owned entity creates a dependency structure that has specific and well-understood consequences for the community. When a single employer dominates a small town's economy in the way that Burns's plant dominates Springfield's, the employer's interests and the community's interests become structurally entangled in ways that make it very difficult to challenge the employer's behavior. Springfield residents who object to the plant's safety record cannot effectively organize to address those objections because their economic survival depends on the plant's continued operation. They cannot vote for politicians who would challenge the plant's operations because those politicians would threaten the jobs that the community depends on. They cannot make collective demands on the plant's operations because any disruption of those operations falls back on them economically. This is not a satirical invention. It is an accurate description of the economic dynamics of single-employer towns, which have existed throughout American economic history and which continue to exist in various forms. The company town, where a single corporate interest owns or dominates the economic life of an entire community, is a real American phenomenon, with a specific history and specific documented consequences for the communities it produces. Springfield is a company town. Burns is the company. And the economic consequences of this arrangement, the specific way that the community's dependency on the plant prevents it from effectively challenging the plant's behavior, is one of the show's most consistently observed and most accurately depicted social dynamics. Homer's specific economic position within this structure is the show's most detailed economic portrait. Homer earns a salary at the nuclear plant that is, by various indications across the show's history, sufficient to maintain the family in their adequate house on Evergreen Terrace, to purchase beer and donuts in the quantities Homer requires, to occasionally go on family vacations, and to cover the various economic emergencies that Springfield's environment consistently produces. The salary is not wealth. It is sufficiency. It is exactly enough to keep the family in the position they occupy, which is the position that the economic structure of Springfield has assigned to a nuclear plant safety inspector. This sufficiency is itself a precise economic observation. Homer does not earn poverty wages. He earns working-class wages. The distinction matters because poverty wages produce a different relationship to one's economic situation than working-class wages do. Working-class wages, by definition, provide enough to sustain the expected standard of living associated with your economic position, which means that sustaining that standard of living requires continuing to work at the job that provides those wages. The dependency is built into the sufficiency. You are not desperate, but you cannot afford to risk the income that maintains your non-desperation. This is why Homer never seriously challenges Burns. Not because he is too stupid to understand the situation, though the crayon does not help. Because challenging Burns means risking the income that maintains the family's adequate house and Homer's beer and the children's school clothes and every specific material thing that the sufficiency provides. The sufficiency is a mechanism of compliance. Enough is exactly enough to bind you to what provides it. The various episodes in which Homer attempts to supplement his income through entrepreneurial ventures illuminate this dynamic from a different angle. When Homer tries to make money outside the plant, through catering or construction or any of the dozens of side ventures the show has explored, the ventures consistently fail in specific ways that return Homer to his position at the plant, and consistently fail in ways that produce narrative comedy while also illustrating the specific economic constraints that make entrepreneurial escape from Homer's economic position structurally difficult. Homer does not fail at these ventures simply because Homer is incompetent, though his competence is limited. He fails because the economic environment he operates in does not provide the conditions necessary for success, and because the safety of sufficient employment at the plant, even terrible sufficient employment at a dangerous plant, consistently represents a better expected outcome than the risk of entrepreneurial failure. The comedy of Homer's business ventures is the comedy of working-class economic constraint dressed as individual incompetence. The Springfield economy has other dimensions that the show explores with the same combination of comedy and precision. Moe's Tavern represents the specifically small business economic position, the business that is marginally viable enough to continue operating but not profitable enough to improve, that exists in constant financial tension between its income and its debts, and that survives through the specific combination of loyalty, economics, and expense management that characterizes small bar operation in economically marginal communities. Moe is not a bad businessman in the sense of making poor decisions. He is a businessman operating in a market that does not provide sufficient returns to build on. His investment in the bar is emotionally significant to him and economically insufficient to build wealth. This is not unusual. Many small businesses are exactly this. Emotionally significant to their owners, sufficient to sustain the lifestyle of operating them, and insufficient to generate the capital accumulation that would change the owner's economic position in any fundamental way. Moe's Tavern is a trap that is also a home, an economic position that is both limiting and sustaining, and Moe has navigated this tension for 36 years with a combination of resignation and attachment that is, in its specificity, deeply human. The Springfield economy is, in its aggregate, a picture of how economic concentration at the top produces a specific kind of economic stasis for everyone below the top. Burns at the top accumulates. Everyone else maintains. The town does not grow because the economic dynamics that would produce growth, distributed investment, competitive enterprise, mobility of capital, are not present in an economy where the primary employer has no interest in and actively resists the kind of diversification that would reduce its own dominance. Springfield stays the same economically because that is what the economic structure of Springfield produces. The same economic positions filled by the same families across the same decades, with the same money flowing through the same channels in the same directions, sustaining the same positions, and producing the same outcomes. The economy is the loop that everything else in Springfield's impossibility expresses. The radiation theory, the coma theory, the collective denial theory all describe the same essential stasis from different angles. The economic structure describes it most simply. Nothing changes because nothing that would produce change is economically viable in a town organized around preserving the conditions that benefit the entity at the top. Springfield is not a ghost town. It is a town where the economic conditions that would allow change to occur have been systematically prevented from developing by the interests that benefit from stasis. And the most powerful of those interests does not just own the power plant. It owns the economy, and the economy owns the town. And the town, in its adequacy, goes on. Section 19. The fan communities that became part of the show. The Simpsons has generated fan communities of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary commitment, communities that have, across the show's history, influenced the show itself in ways that are both documented and undocumented. The relationship between the show and its most engaged audience is not one-directional. It is a conversation, sometimes acknowledged as such and sometimes not, in which the audience's engagement with the show has produced material that the show has incorporated, responded to, engaged with, and occasionally fought with in the specific way that a creative entity with institutional interests fights with the community that its success has built around it. The earliest organized Simpsons fan communities existed in the pre-internet context of television appreciation clubs, localized groups organized around shared enthusiasm for the show that operated through newsletters and zines and in-person meetings at a time when the infrastructure for large-scale fan organization did not yet exist. These communities were small by the standards of what would follow, but they established patterns of engagement with the show that persist in the current fan community. Close attention to continuity, systematic documentation of the show's internal history, active analysis of thematic content, and a relationship to the show's production that went beyond passive viewership into active participation in the construction of the show's cultural meaning. The arrival of the internet transformed the scale and character of Simpsons fandom in a way that no other development has. The Rec. Arts. TV. Simpsons Newsgroup, which predates the World Wide Web and operated through the basic infrastructure of early internet text communication, was, for a period of years, the primary organized space for Simpsons fan discussion and analysis, and the quality and depth of analysis produced in that space was, by any reasonable measure, remarkable. The people who participated in Rats in its peak period were doing things with the show's content that the show's own production was not doing in any systematic way. Tracking continuity across seasons with a completeness that no single member of the production staff was maintaining. Cataloging every background joke, every cultural reference, every Easter egg, every inconsistency, every recurring visual gag, building a comprehensive index of the show's internal history that was more thorough than anything the production itself possessed. Analyzing the show's thematic content with the kind of sustained intellectual engagement that academic critics bring to literary texts, and producing analysis that was, in the opinion of some members of the production who encountered it, better than anything that had been written about the show in mainstream criticism. The production noticed. This is documented in multiple sources. Writers and producers who were aware of the fan community's analysis described reading it with a mixture of amazement and discomfort. Amazement because the analysis was genuinely good, because it caught things they had not consciously intended but that were there, because it identified patterns in the show's content that illuminated what the show was doing in ways they had not fully articulated to themselves. Discomfort because it was coming from outside the production, from people who had not made the show and who nonetheless understood it in some respects better than the people who had made it. The episode in which the cast and crew visit a Simpsons convention is one of the most self-aware pieces of content the show has ever produced, and it is self-aware specifically about the fan community and about the production's complicated relationship to it. The episode depicts fans whose engagement with the show has produced a level of detailed knowledge that exceeds the production's own knowledge of itself, fans who catch continuity errors that the production did not notice, fans whose enthusiasm for the show's content is so total that it has become their primary way of organizing their relationship to the world. The episode is affectionate toward these fans in ways that are also slightly condescending, which is the specific mixture of feelings that the production actually has toward its most engaged audience. They are grateful for the depth of engagement. They are occasionally unsettled by the intensity of it. They understand that the fan community's sophisticated analysis is a tribute to what they made. They also find it uncomfortable when the tribute reveals inconsistencies or implies that the fans understand the show better than the people who made it. The Homer's Enemy episode, in which a new plant employee named Frank Grimes comes to Springfield and cannot understand how Homer Simpson can exist in a functional society, is the episode most frequently cited as the production's direct response to a specific strain of fan critique. The episode is addressed to a reader who has been watching the show carefully enough to understand all the ways Homer's existence is implausible, and it dramatizes that reader's frustration by embodying it in a character. Frank Grimes is the fan who loves the show but cannot understand how Springfield works, and the episode's conclusion, in which Grimes dies of the frustration of trying to understand, is either a joke about the futility of demanding logical consistency from a comedy or a direct statement to the fans who have been demanding that consistency. Both readings are supported by the episode. The show made it knowing both readings would be available. This is the production engaging with its fan community at the level of complexity that the fan community was engaging with the show, and the engagement is more interesting precisely because it is not resolving into a single meaning. The internet fan theories we discussed in the original transcript section belong to this same tradition of fan engagement that crosses into the territory of what the production itself is doing. The Homer's coma theory, the radiation mutation theory, the Springfield geography theories, all of these emerged from fan communities doing the same thing that the production does when it makes the show. Looking at the available material and finding in it patterns that illuminate something about what the material is doing. Patterns that are meaningful whether or not they were consciously intended. The production's relationship to these theories has been consistent and interesting. They acknowledge them. They engage with them, sometimes directly, as in the season 34 fake deleted scene about the coma theory. They do not confirm them or deny them in any way that would definitively close the interpretive space they occupy. The production's refusal to close the space, the consistent non-confirmation that maintains the theory's possibility without endorsing them, is itself a specific kind of engagement, a way of acknowledging that the fan analysis has touched something real about the show without committing the production to what that real thing is. The most sophisticated fan communities around The Simpsons today operate across multiple platforms with a level of organizational sophistication and informational completeness that would have been impossible in the Rats era. They maintain databases of every episode, every character, every location, every background joke, every cultural reference, every production note available from DVD commentaries and interviews and social media. They produce video essays with production values that exceed the production values of most academic video content. They engage with each new episode with the full weight of 36 seasons of accumulated knowledge as context. The show is being watched by people who understand it more comprehensively than anyone has ever understood any television show in history. Not understanding it better than the people who made it, in the sense of being able to produce better episodes, understanding it more comprehensively, in the sense of being able to bring the full history of every creative decision to bear on any specific new decision, in the sense of having internalized the show as a total object in a way that individual episodes of production cannot achieve. This creates a specific challenge for the production in its current era. When you are making new episodes for an audience that knows everything, including the patterns that previous episodes have established, the things the show has already done, the specific ways the show has already addressed specific situations, the options available to you are constrained by the audience's comprehensive knowledge in a way that they would not be if the audience were encountering the show fresh. The production navigates this by treating the fan community's knowledge as a resource rather than a constraint, by finding creative possibilities in the depth of the show's history that would not be visible without that depth. The episodes that succeed in the current era are frequently the ones that use the audience's comprehensive knowledge of the show's history as their starting point, that build on what the audience already knows in ways that produce something new, precisely because of the depth of the shared reference. The fan community has become part of the show, not as a formal element of the production, but as the interpretive context within which the production operates, the audience for whom new episodes are being made, whose knowledge and engagement shapes what the production can do, and how the production understands what it is doing. Springfield exists in some meaningful sense in the minds of the fan community as much as it exists in the episodes the production makes. The town has been built in the collective imagination of its most devoted viewers with a completeness and consistency that exceeds what any individual episode provides. The fan community maintains Springfield across the gaps between episodes, in the spaces between seasons, through the long history of a show that has been running for 36 years and that has produced, in that time, not just a television show but a world. And the people who live in that world, who maintain it, who watch its episodes and discuss them and analyze them and argue about them, and love them with the specific intensity of people who have organized a significant portion of their cultural life around a specific piece of work, are as much a part of what The Simpsons is as any element of its production. Springfield would not be what it is without the people who watch it. And the people who watch it would not be what they are without Springfield. That is the loop that the fan community represents. And it is, in its own specific way, as impossible and as durable and as quietly extraordinary as everything else about that impossible, durable, quietly extraordinary town. Section 20. What Springfield knows that we don't. Here is the simplest version of what 36 seasons of The Simpsons adds up to. A family lives in a town. The town has a nuclear plant at its center that has been leaking invisible poison into the water and air since before any of them were born. The family is yellow. The father has an IQ that clinical psychology would classify as a disability, the product of a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, a childhood shaped by the disappearance of his mother at the hands of the same billionaire who employs him. The mother holds the family together through a patience that costs her more than she ever charges. The son resists everything and understands more than his resistance suggests. The daughter sees everything clearly and is consistently penalized for the clarity. The baby watches and says nothing, and is probably the most dangerous person in Springfield. The town's principal is an imposter. The police chief is useless. The billionaire is over 100 years old. The politician is captured. The preacher has stopped believing. The doctor has more diseases than he has treated. The barman has stopped hoping. The neighbor has had his rage conditioned out of him, and his wife killed by the man next door, and his house destroyed by the incompetent sympathy of the community, and has responded to all of it with a programmed grace that is indistinguishable from genuine grace and more heartbreaking than either. Nobody ages, nobody learns, nobody changes, and yet, every episode something happens that matters. Something is felt that is real. Some piece of the human situation is illuminated with enough precision and enough comedy that you laugh, and in the laughter is the thing you needed to understand but could not have received directly. This is what Springfield knows. It knows that the most dangerous truths are the ones that need a joke to survive contact with an audience that would resist them if they arrived unprotected. It knows that the family you love is inseparable from the systems that have broken them. It knows that the town you live in is the product of decisions made by people you have never met and cannot hold accountable, but whose decisions are the foundation of every specific thing about your life. It knows that the loop you are in, the specifically American loop of adequate sufficiency and structural powerlessness and convenient forgetting, and the couch that you always return to at the end of every episode, is both a trap and a home. Springfield knows all of this, and Springfield continues anyway. The family sits on the couch. The father goes to work. The mother holds things together. The children do what children do. The plant keeps running. The billionaire keeps living. The loop keeps floating. And you keep watching. Because somewhere in the watching is what the show has always been trying to deliver. Not the lesson, not the argument, not the conclusion that everything is fine or everything is doomed, or the answer to what you should do about the specific architecture of powerlessness that the show has been documenting for 36 years. Just the recognition, the specific feeling of being seen, of having your particular version of the human situation acknowledged in the terms it actually operates in, without sentimentality and without false comfort, and with the specific warmth that comes from comedy that is honest about what it is depicting. You live in Springfield. We all do. Different walls, different streets, different specific details, different specific versions of the billionaire and the plant and the principal and the neighbor, but the same structure, the same loop, the same family trying to be okay in conditions that were not designed for their okayness. Springfield knows this. The show has known it since 1989. The question is whether you know it now, and what you are going to do with knowing it. That part, the show cannot tell you. The comedy ends, the credits roll, the couch gag was funny, the episode was good, everything resets. What happens outside the loop is yours. Afterward, the things you notice on the 100th viewing. There is a specific kind of attention that only very long familiarity produces. You cannot access it by watching an episode once, or twice, or even 10 times. It requires the kind of accumulated viewing that most people only achieve with works they love unreasonably, works they return to, not because they have forgotten what happens, but because the returning itself produces something new. Because each visit brings a slightly different version of yourself to the same material, and the encounter between those slightly different selves and the same material keeps generating something that was not available on the previous visit. The Simpsons, because it has been running for 36 seasons, because it has been in constant syndication for 30 years, because it has been available on streaming platforms for nearly a decade, has been watched at this level of accumulation by more people than almost any other creative work in history. There are people alive today who have seen specific Simpsons episodes hundreds of times, not because they are particularly obsessive, though some of them are, but because the show has been on television, continuously, for their entire lives, and the specific episodes of the show that were broadcast most frequently in syndication have been encountered, unavoidably in the background of other activities, in the periphery of other viewing, in the ambient television presence that forms the cultural wallpaper of American domestic life. These people know the show in a way that no critic or academic can fully access through deliberate study. They know it the way you know a piece of music you have heard so many times that you can hear it in your head without any external prompt, know every note, every transition, every moment where the melody does something unexpected that still surprises you after 100 encounters. Because the surprise is built into the structure of the thing, rather than into your expectation of it. And what these people notice on the 100th viewing of a specific episode is not what you notice on the first viewing. The first viewing gives you the story, the plot, the jokes, the emotional beats, the basic experience of the episode as a coherent unit of entertainment. The 100th viewing gives you something else. Something that is not the story, but is in the story. Something that is not the jokes, but is in the jokes. The specific texture of a character's delivery in a line you have heard 100 times that you notice, on the 101st hearing, contains something you have never heard before. Not because the delivery changed, but because you changed. Because the 100 previous hearings prepared you to receive something that was always there, but that required all those hearings to become audible. The show banks on this. Not consciously, not as a strategy, but as a consequence of being made with the level of craft and density that The Simpsons writers' room at its best was capable of. The show is made by people who know that the audience will return, who know that the early episodes in particular have been watched so many times that the audience could perform them from memory, and who put things in the show for the version of the audience that has watched it that many times. Not special content for power users, just the full depth of what they were capable of, trusting that the depth would be available whenever the viewer was ready to receive it. This is what the best creative work does. It meets you where you are. The first time you watch a great episode of The Simpsons, you receive what you are capable of receiving. The 50th time, you receive more. The 100th time, you receive something you could not have imagined being available in something you thought you already completely knew. Springfield rewards the kind of attention most things train you not to pay. The slow, accumulated, loving, repeated attention of someone who keeps coming back because there is always something left to find. And there always is. Every episode you have already seen contains something you have not seen yet. The show is still showing it to you. You just have to watch closely enough to notice.